Welcome to Hearths of Myths. Close your eyes. Settle into the quiet space around you. Let the heavy burdens of the waking world slip from your shoulders and allow your breathing to slow. Listen to the silence between the words. Today, the air grows thick and the light begins to fade. We are leaving the sunlit marble temples and the golden halls of the sky far behind us. We are descending. We are traveling down into the deep, echoing caverns of the ancient earth, long before the familiar gods took their thrones upon the high peaks. We are venturing into the dark, suffocating roots of the world to uncover the origins of a nightmare, a creature so unnatural, so fierce, that its very name became the definition of the impossible. We are tracing the bloodline of the fire-breather. We are uncovering the complete saga of the Chimera. But to understand the monster, you must first understand the absolute darkness that forged her. You must understand the soil from which she sprang. Long before the heroes carved their names into history, before the ships with painted eyes sailed the wine-dark seas, the universe was a terrifying, unformed expanse. In the poetry of Hesiod, the ancient Greek singer of the divine lineage, the cosmos was a place of heavy, physical forces. Beneath the solid ground of the earth, far beneath the deepest oceans and the roots of the oldest mountains, lay a realm of pure, staggering vastness. This was Tartarus. Imagine a chasm so profound, so impossibly deep, that if a heavy anvil forged of solid bronze were dropped from the surface of the earth, it would fall for 9 days and 9 nights, hurtling through the suffocating blackness, only to finally strike the bottom on the 10th day. That is the distance of dread. Tartarus was not merely a location. It was a living, breathing void, a prison of storm and shadow, a place where the very air was a heavy, stagnant weight pressing against the stone. It was a realm of perpetual gloom, walled in by bronze, wrapped in triple layers of darkness. It was in this incomprehensible depth, amid the groaning bedrock of creation, that the earth herself, the primordial mother known as Gaia, harbored a deep and terrible resentment. The new gods, the Olympians, had begun to impose their bright, rigid order upon the world. They had locked away the older, wilder forces, and the earth, feeling the weight of this new authority, sought to push back. She sought to remind the ordered sky that the chaotic ground below still possessed the power to unmake everything. Through an ancient, terrifying union with Tartarus, the earth mingling with the deepest abyss, Gaia brought forth her final, most horrific child, a weapon of pure, unadulterated devastation. His name was Typhon. Picture a being whose scale defies mortal comprehension. Typhon was not a god in the way we imagine the human-shaped deities of the sky. He was a natural disaster given flesh. He was the hurricane, the earthquake, and the volcanic eruption bound together in a single, colossal form. Hesiod describes him with a level of detail that meant to instill pure, paralyzing terror in the hearts of the ancient listeners. From his massive shoulders grew 100 heads of a frightful dragon, 100 serpentine necks twisting and undulating in the murky air. Each of these heads possessed dark, flickering tongues that tasted the terror of the world. And from beneath the brows of these 100 monstrous faces, fire blazed relentlessly. When Typhon glared, it was as if 100 mountains had opened their fiery maws to scorch the heavens. But the true horror of Typhon lay in the sounds he produced. His voices were a cacophony of the world's most terrifying noises. Sometimes, his 100 mouths spoke the language of the high gods, a booming, arrogant thunder. Other times, they let out the deafening, continuous bellowing of a pride of enraged lions. Then, the sound would shift, morphing into the high-pitched, echoing yelps of a pack of wild hounds on a bloody hunt. And finally, a long, drawn-out hissing would emerge, a sound so loud and piercing that the great mountains echoed with the vibration. Typhon was the storm that sought to break the sky. He was the ultimate embodiment of chaotic, untamed force. His power was so absolute that he nearly brought the ordered universe to its knees, engaging in a cataclysmic struggle with the ruler of the sky. The heat of their battle caused the deep oceans to boil, and the entire earth shook until the foundations of Tartarus itself groaned in agony. Though he was eventually cast down, banished back into the suffocating darkness beneath the earth, his essence could not be destroyed. Typhon remained in the deep, a boiling, restless source of subterranean fire and violent winds. He became the father of the damaging gales, the sudden, violent squalls that tear ships apart upon the dark waters and destroy the labor of the farmers on the land. But a father of monsters requires a mother of equal terror. The chaotic storm needed a vessel to harbor its destructive seed. This brings us to the second progenitor of our nightmare, a creature of profound, contradictory horror. Far removed from the golden light of the sun, hidden away in a subterranean cave in the mysterious land of Arima, dwelled a being named Echidna. She lived in the hollows of the earth, far from immortal gods and mortal men alike, in a place where the air was always damp and the stone was always cold. Echidna was a creature of duality, a physical manifestation of beauty and death, seamlessly fused together. The ancient texts describe her upper half as that of a nymph. She possessed glancing, captivating eyes and fair, flawless cheeks. To look upon her face in the dim light of her cavern was to see the alluring, ethereal beauty of a divine maiden. Her voice may have been soft, her features delicate, promising comfort and grace. But this upper beauty was a cruel biological deception. From the waist down, Echidna was something else entirely. She descended into the massive, powerful coils of a monstrous serpent. She was a huge, awe-inspiring snake, covered in thick, speckled scales that glinted wetly in the subterranean gloom. Her lower half was pure, reptilian muscle, designed to constrict, to crush, and to slither silently through the deep, rocky crevices of the underworld. Echidna did not age. The ancient poet tells us she was deathless and immune to the ravages of time. While mortal generations withered and crumbled into dust, Echidna remained in her cave beneath the earth, eternally young, eternally ravenous. She fed on raw flesh. She waited in the dark, a patient, immortal predator, snatching any unfortunate creature that wandered too close to the black mouth of her underground domain. The psychological horror of Echidna lies in this stark division of her form. The human mind seeks patterns. It seeks consistency. When we see a beautiful face, we expect a human heart. When we see the coils of a viper, we expect the flat, unblinking eyes of a reptile. Echidna shattered this expectation. She was a biological paradox, a creature that lured you with the familiar comfort of humanity, only to drag you down into the cold, crushing embrace of the primal beast. It was in the suffocating darkness beneath the earth, where the sun has never once shone, that these two forces of ultimate chaos met. The ancient texts tell us that Typhon, the terrible and outrageous storm demon, was joined in love to Echidna, the half-nymph with glancing eyes. It is an impossible union to visualize. The deafening, fiery, hundred-headed hurricane of Typhon, wrapping around the silent, cold, muscular coils of the speckled serpent. It was a mating of pure devastation, a joining of the violent forces of the sky and the creeping terrors of the deep earth. From this grim and terrifying union, a brood of nightmares was born into the world. Echidna, resting in the shadows of her cavern, brought forth a lineage of monsters that would plague heroes and gods for generations to come. The children of Typhon and Echidna were not born to build, nor were they born to nurture. They were born specifically to guard, to destroy, and to terrorize. They were the physical embodiments of human anxiety, the shapes that fear takes when the fire dies down and the night creeps in. Before we witness the birth of the Chimera herself, we must look at the siblings who shared her dark, subterranean nursery. Understanding her brothers and sisters helps us understand the fundamental nature of her bloodline. It was a bloodline characterized by multiplicity, by venom, and by unyielding ferocity. First, Echidna gave birth to Orthrus. He was a monstrous, two-headed hound. Orthrus was a creature of immense cruelty, destined to serve as a guardian at the very edges of the known world. He was sent far away to the island of Erythea, beyond the waters of the ocean stream, where the sun sets in a blaze of red. There, amidst the perpetual twilight, he guarded the magnificent red cattle of a three-bodied giant. Orthrus was a sentinel of isolation, a beast bred solely for violence and protection, whose dual heads meant he never truly slept. After Orthrus, the cavern echoed with a deeper, more resonant growl. Echidna brought forth a creature whose very name is synonymous with the inescapable finality of death. She birthed Cerberus, the unspeakable, brazen-voiced hound of Hades. Cerberus was a terror of anatomical excess. According to Hesiod, he possessed 50 heads, a writhing, snapping mass of jaws and teeth. He fed on raw flesh, just like his mother. Cerberus was the ultimate barrier. He was placed at the gloomy gates of the underworld, where the river Styx flows black and silent. His purpose was simple and absolute: to ensure that the dead, once they had crossed the threshold into the House of Shadows, could never, ever leave. He would greet those entering with fawning tails and lowered ears, a deceptive welcome to the eternal dark. But if any soul attempted to pass back through the gates to return to the world of the living, Cerberus would devour them whole. He was the guardian of the one-way door, the physical representation of the finality of mortality. The dark cavern of Arima continued to breed. The next child, born to the storm, and the serpent was a creature of pure, relentless toxicity. Echidna birthed the Lernaean Hydra. If Cerberus represented the barrier of death, the Hydra represented the inescapable spread of disease and corruption. She was a massive water serpent, dwelling in the stagnant, rotting swamps of Lerna. The Hydra possessed numerous heads. Some sources say 9, others say 50, and her breath was so thoroughly saturated with venom that merely smelling her footprints could prove fatal to a mortal man. The true nightmare of the Hydra was her resilience. For every head that was severed from her thick, pulsing neck, 2 more would immediately violently erupt from the bloody stump. She was a monster that weaponized damage, a creature that grew stronger and more complicated the more you tried to destroy her. She was the embodiment of a problem that cannot be solved by simple force, a creeping, multiplying terror nurtured by the dark goddess Hera herself, specifically to be a bane to the heroes of the earth. Orthrus, Cerberus, the Hydra, 2-headed, 50-headed, multi-headed, guardians of the sunset, guardians of the grave, and the toxic guardian of the swamp. This was the family. This was the bloodline, a lineage defined by excess, by unnatural combinations of flesh, by venom, and by a deep, abiding hatred for the ordered, sunlit world. They were the children of the void, the offspring of the storm and the snake, born in the damp dark of a subterranean cave. And yet, despite the 2 heads of Orthrus, the 50 jaws of Cerberus, and the regenerating venom of the Hydra, the most bizarre, the most visually terrifying, and the most inexplicable child of Typhon and Echidna was yet to be born. Deep in the damp shadows, where the stone walls wept cold water, and the air smelled of ozone and raw meat, Echidna prepared to give birth once more. The fierce, destructive winds of Typhon had mingled deeply with her serpentine nature. The pressure within her immortal body was immense, a boiling crucible of violent genetics. The creature forming in the dark was absorbing the raw, burning heat of its father, the storm demon whose eyes flashed with fire. It was absorbing the silent, creeping malice of its mother, the beautiful nymph with the crushing lower coils. But it was also gathering something else, an element of sheer, chaotic absurdity, a form so disjointed, so structurally broken that its mere existence was an insult to the laws of nature established by the Olympian gods. The air in the cavern grew intensely hot. The damp stone hissed as moisture evaporated instantly. The smell of sulfur and burning hair filled the narrow tunnels of Arima. The temperature continued to rise, a dry, suffocating heat that promised ash and ruin. And then, with a sound that was part lion's roar, part serpent's hiss, and part the bleating of a terrified herd animal, the Chimera tore her way into existence. She did not emerge as a single, cohesive entity. She emerged as a fractured nightmare, a chaotic assembly of distinct and terrifying beasts forcibly sewn together by the dark magic of her parentage. She possessed the fierce, predatory grace of a feline, the stubborn, horned brutality of a mountain goat, and the venomous, cold-blooded strike of a reptile. She was a creature of unquenchable fire, breathing a devastating, roaring flame from her multiple maws. She was a living furnace, an untamed wildfire encased in a body of flesh, fur, and scales. She was the ultimate physical manifestation of her parents' chaotic union, a walking, breathing disaster area. She was born in the dark, but she would not stay there. The cavern of Arima could not contain her heat. The Chimera was destined to leave the subterranean gloom and walk upon the surface of the earth. She was destined to find a mountainous, rugged land where she could look down upon the fragile, wooden homes of mortal men. She was destined to bring the scorching fire of Tartarus up to the sunlit world. The monster had taken her first breath, and that breath was a stream of divine, inextinguishable fire. The saga had truly begun. The earth would soon feel the heavy, unnatural tread of the Chimera. Listen to the crackle of the flame in the distance. Feel the sudden, dry heat pushing against the cool air of the room. The beast is awake. The heat of the primordial cavern slowly bleeds out into the open air. as the creature dragged its heavy, disjointed form from the subterranean depths of Arima, the surrounding landscape immediately began to suffer. The damp mosses clinging to the rocks outside the cave mouth shriveled and blackened in an instant, turning to fine gray ash before the beast had even fully emerged into the twilight. The air itself seemed to warp and shimmer around her, the oxygen burning away, creating a suffocating vacuum of intense, radiating heat. The physical manifestation of the Chimera was not merely a sight to behold. It was a devastating sensory experience that assaulted the earth long before the creature ever struck a blow. To gaze upon the Chimera, as the ancient blind poet Homer described her in the verses of the Iliad, was to look upon a creature of immortal make, not human. She was a biological impossibility, an organism that should have collapsed under the weight of its own contradictory anatomy. Yet she moved with terrifying, destructive grace. The ancient mind struggled to categorize her. She was a walking violation of the natural boundaries established by the Olympian gods. She was a lion in her foreparts, a serpent in her hindparts, and in her middle, rising grotesquely from the spine, the head of a goat. Let us slow down and examine this nightmare closely, piece by impossible piece. Let the terrifying reality of this creature take shape in the quiet darkness of your imagination. The vanguard of the Chimera, the terrifying face she presented to the world, was the pure, unadulterated form of an apex predator. The front of her body was that of a monstrous, fully grown lion. This was not the noble, sun-drenched beast of the African plains, but a twisted, hyper-aggressive manifestation of mammalian fury. The skull was broad and unimaginably heavy, built to crush bone and tear through the thickest armor. Her eyes, burning with the inherited malice of her father Typhon, were the color of molten gold, lacking any warmth or mercy. They were the eyes of a creature that knew only hunger and hatred. The mane surrounding this leonine head was thick, coarse, and matted. It did not blow freely in the wind, but seemed to stand on end, crackling with dry, static energy, colored in shades of dried blood and charred wood. The musculature of her forelegs was a study in devastating power. The tendons pulled tight like thick ship cables beneath a golden pelt that was scarred and scorched by her own internal fires. When she placed a massive paw upon the earth, the claws, thick, curved iron hooks, dug deeply into the soil, leaving deep, smoldering gouges in the rock and dirt. The sheer weight of her lion half anchored her to the ground, providing the terrifying stability needed for her to launch herself forward with explosive speed. The sound of the lion's roar was not a simple animal cry. It was a physical force. When the jaws unhinged, revealing rows of yellowed, dagger-like teeth and a rough, dark tongue, the resulting sound vibrated in the chest of anyone unfortunate enough to hear it. It was a deep, guttural thunder that mimicked the earthquakes of her father, a sound that paralyzed prey through sheer acoustic trauma. The lion forefront represented the brute force of the monster, the primal, recognizable terror of being hunted, of being run down and overpowered by superior physical strength. But the true, mind-bending horror of the Chimera did not lie in the lion. It lay in the grotesque anomaly rising from the center of her back. Just behind the heavy shoulder blades of the lion, where the spine should have smoothly transitioned into the powerful hindquarters of a feline, the anatomy violently rebelled against nature. The vertebrae bulged upward, thickening and twisting into a thick muscular neck covered in coarse, wiry hair. and at the end of this neck sat the head of a mountain goat. In the natural world, the goat is a creature of the crags and the high pastures. It is an herbivore, a stubborn but ultimately harmless beast of burden and sustenance. To see the head of a goat grafted onto the body of a monstrous predator is a profound psychological shock. It is the jarring collision of the mundane and the demonic. The goat head of the Chimera was large, aggressive, and crowned with two sweeping, razor-sharp horns that curved backward, dark and polished like old obsidian. The eyes of the goat were a pale, dead yellow, featuring the eerie, horizontal rectangular pupils characteristic of the species. These horizontal slits gave the goat head an expression of cold, alien detachment, a stark and terrifying contrast to the burning, focused rage of the lion below it. The inclusion of the goat in this unholy trinity was deeply symbolic in the ancient world. The goat represented the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the mountains, the harsh winter storms, and the stubborn resilience of the wild. But the Chimera twisted this symbolism into something profoundly destructive. For it was not the lion that posed the greatest threat, nor the serpent at the rear. It was the goat that breathed the fire of the Chimera, as described by the ancient poets, was not ordinary flame. It was the dread might of blazing fire, a divine and inextinguishable element inherited directly from the subterranean furnaces of Tartarus. The goat head did not merely exhale sparks, it vomited a continuous, roaring torrent of volcanic destruction. Imagine the sensation of this fire. It did not crackle pleasantly like a hearth. It roared with the deafening sound of a rushing waterfall. When the goat opened its mouth, the air around the creature instantly superheated. The throat of the goat would glow with an intense, terrifying internal luminescence, a bright, blinding, white-hot light that shone through the coarse skin of the neck. Then the flame would erupt. It was a thick, viscous fire, clinging to whatever it touched, burning through wood, melting bronze, and turning stone into molten slag. The smell accompanying this fire was not the scent of burning wood, but the acrid, choking stench of sulfur, brimstone, and roasting earth. The heat was so intense that it created its own weather systems, drawing the surrounding air into a localized, swirling firestorm. To stand even 100 paces from the Chimera was to feel the moisture evaporating from your skin, to feel your hair begin to singe, and your lungs burn with every breath of the scorched, oxygen-starved air. The goat head, with its cold, rectangular eyes, would sweep this torrent of fire back and forth across the landscape, turning lush forests into desolate, gray wastelands of ash in a matter of moments. The sheer absurdity of a goat, a creature known for chewing grass and navigating steep cliffs, acting as the primary weapon of mass destruction, is what elevated the Chimera from a simple monster to a figure of mythic dread. It forced the ancient observer to abandon all logic. You could not fight the Chimera by anticipating the behavior of a lion or a goat, because she was neither, and yet she was both. And the horror did not end there. Trailing behind the massive, lumbering body, replacing the hind legs and tail of the lion, was the final piece of the nightmare. The rear of the Chimera was a massive, writhing serpent. This was not a small vestigial appendage. It was a fully formed, highly venomous snake, as thick as the trunk of an old olive tree, covered in hard, overlapping scales that grated against the earth with a sound like sharpening steel. the serpent functioned as the rearguard, the treacherous defense mechanism that ensured no hero or predator could ever safely approach the monster from behind. While the lion roared and the goat breathed its devastating fire, the serpent hissed a high, continuous warning note that cut through the cacophony of the other two heads. The serpent's head was flat and triangular, the unmistakable shape of a viper, with unblinking, lidless eyes that tracked movement with cold, reptilian calculation. The contrast between the front and the rear of the chimera was deeply unsettling. The lion and the goat were creatures of hot blood, radiating intense heat, their fur and hair coarse and dry. The serpent, however, was a creature of the cold earth. Its scales were perpetually slick and freezing to the touch, a manifestation of the damp, dark underworld from which Echidna hailed. The serpent tail possessed a terrifying degree of autonomy. While the massive body was engaged in destroying a village or hunting a herd of cattle, the tail would whip and strike independently, defending the blind spots. Its fangs were as long as daggers, dripping with a highly potent corrosive venom. This venom was so toxic that a single drop striking the earth would kill the grass instantly, leaving small blackened craters in the soil. If a warrior somehow managed to survive the heat of the fire and the crushing weight of the lion's paws, they would inevitably fall victim to the lightning-fast, silent strike of the serpent at their back. The anatomy of the chimera presented a profound logistical problem for the creature itself. How does such a disjointed entity move? How do three separate brains, three different sets of instincts, coordinate a single body? The movement of the chimera was not graceful. It was a heavy, asymmetrical, and deeply disturbing gait. The massive, muscular forelegs of the lion pulled the heavy body forward, while the thick, muscular coils of the serpent pushed from behind, slithering and dragging across the ground. The creature lumbered, its massive weight causing the earth to tremble rhythmically with every step. The spine, burdened by the immense weight of the goat head, swayed and lurched. Yet, despite this apparent clumsiness, the chimera was terrifyingly fast when provoked. The sheer power of the lion's shoulders, combined with the explosive uncoiling of the serpent tail, allowed the beast to launch itself over vast distances, crashing into its targets with the unstoppable momentum of a falling boulder. To witness the chimera in motion was to experience a profound sense of vertigo and nausea. The eye could not settle on a single focal point. If you watched the golden, roaring head of the lion, you would miss the blinding flash of fire erupting from the goat above it. If you focused on dodging the flames, the silent, green-scaled death of the serpent would strike from the shadows. The three heads were in constant, restless motion. Sometimes they seemed to act in perfect, lethal harmony. Other times, the ancient texts hint at a dark, internal friction. The lion might snap its massive jaws at the biting heat of the goat's fire, or the serpent might hiss and strike at the lion's flanks if the movement became too chaotic. The chimera was at war with the world, but it was also inherently at war with itself. This internal conflict, this impossible fusion of disparate elements, was the core of the chimera's mythological terror. In the cosmology of the ancient Greeks, the universe was a place of divine order. The gods of Olympus had defeated the chaotic Titans to establish a world where everything had its designated place, its proper form, and its specific function. The birds ruled the air, the fish ruled the sea, and the beasts of the field adhered to the laws of their kind. The Chimera was a direct, walking insult to this divine order. She was a chaotic jumble of pieces that did not belong together. She represented the terrifying possibility that the laws of nature were fragile, that the chaotic, monstrous forces of the primordial void could bubble up and distort the fabric of reality at any moment. She was a reminder that beneath the thin veneer of civilization and ordered thought, the universe was still capable of producing horrors beyond human comprehension. The psychological impact of facing such a creature was paralyzing. A warrior trained to fight a lion knows the limits of a lion. A warrior knows that a lion cannot breathe fire, and a lion does not have a venomous strike at its rear. But when faced with the Chimera, all training, all logic, and all prior knowledge became instantly useless. The mind fractured, trying to process the intersecting threats of teeth, flame, and venom. The sheer sensory overload, the deafening roar, the blinding light, the suffocating heat, the acrid smell, the cold hiss, was enough to break the courage of the bravest mortals. The Chimera did not just kill. She dismantled the human capacity for reason. She reduced proud, armored men to weeping, terrified children, fleeing blindly into the rocks to escape the unnatural nightmare. And so, this impossible amalgamation of lion, goat, and serpent, breathing the inextinguishable fire of the underworld, began to move. The earth groaned beneath her heavy paws. The air shriveled before her flaming breath. The dark cavern of Arima was left far behind, a cold, empty womb in the deep earth. The creature was drawn by instinct, by the dark, destructive urges planted within her by Typhon and Echidna, to seek out a domain worthy of her terror. She turned her 3 heads away from the desolate, uninhabited wastelands and began a long, slow, devastating march toward the lands of men. She sought a place of deep ravines, of high, craggy mountains, and of fertile valleys ripe for burning. She moved with relentless, terrifying purpose, a walking wildfire wrapped in flesh and scales, her golden eyes fixed on the horizon, bringing the heat of Tartarus to the sunlit world, leaving nothing but a trail of blackened stone and white ash in her wake. This trail of ash wound its way southward and eastward, crossing jagged mountain ranges and dry, desolate plains, guided by an ancient, blind instinct for devastation. The creature did not simply travel. She eroded the world as she passed. The heavy, irregular thud of the lion's paws, the dragging, abrasive slide of the serpent's scales, and the suffocating, superheated breath of the goat transformed the earth into a sterile, black scar. She was moving toward a specific destiny, drawn to a landscape that mirrored the rugged, unforgiving nature of her own impossible anatomy. She was heading toward the sun-drenched, mountainous coast of the Great Sea, to a territory known to the ancient world as Lycia. Before the arrival of the fire, Lycia was a realm of profound, wild beauty. Imagine a coastline where the deep, azure waters of the Mediterranean crash against towering, sheer cliffs of pale limestone. The sea here was not a gentle, lapping tide, but a heavy, rhythmic force that had carved deep caves and hidden coves into the bedrock over countless millennia. Above these cliffs, the land rose sharply, almost violently, into the sky. The Taurus Mountains dominated the horizon, their peaks often shrouded in a soft, white mist that burned away only in the intense heat of the midday sun. The slopes of these mountains were carpeted with ancient, silent forests. Massive cedar trees, their trunks thick with fragrant resin, stood like silent sentinels on the ridges. Below them grew dense groves of pine and wild olive, their roots clinging desperately to the rocky soil. The air in Lycia was a complex, intoxicating mixture of salt spray from the ocean, the sharp, clean scent of pine needles, and the sweet, earthy aroma of wild herbs baking in the sun. It was a landscape of extreme verticality, a place where a man could stand on a snowy peak and look down upon a warm, turquoise bay in the same breathless glance. In the deep, fertile valleys cradled between these imposing mountains, the Lycian people had carved out a quiet, prosperous existence. They were a resilient folk, accustomed to the demands of a rugged environment. They built their homes of heavy stone and thick timber, structures designed to withstand the fierce winter winds that sometimes howled down from the high passes. They terraced the lower slopes, building intricate, stepping walls of dry stone to hold the precious soil in place. Here, they cultivated orchards of fig and pomegranate, and vast, silvery groves of olive trees that provided the lifeblood of their economy. The rhythm of life in Lycia was dictated by the seasons and the slow, steady turning of the earth. In the spring, the valleys erupted in a riot of wildflowers, and the sound of newborn lambs bleating echoed off the canyon walls. In the heat of summer, the farmers retreated to the shade of the ancient trees, listening to the deafening rhythmic hum of the cicadas. It was a life of hard work, but it was grounded in a deep, abiding harmony with the natural world. The gods of the earth and the sky were respected, propitiated with offerings of grain and wine, and in return, the land yielded its bounty. There was a profound peace here, a quiet isolation protected by the impenetrable mountains to the north and the vast open sea to the south. The Lycians believed themselves safe in their rugged paradise. They could not have known that the very geography that protected them, the deep ravines, the hidden caves, the craggy, inaccessible peaks, was exactly what the nightmare was seeking. The change did not happen overnight. The arrival of the Chimera was preceded by a slow, creeping alteration in the atmosphere, a subtle poisoning of the environment that filled the local populace with an undefined, paralyzing dread long before they ever saw the beast. It began with the wind. The prevailing breezes that normally blew in from the cool, refreshing surface of the sea abruptly died. The air grew stagnant, heavy, and unnaturally still. Then, a new wind began to stir from the northern mountain passes. It was a dry, baking wind, carrying with it a faint, acrid scent that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat. It smelled of sulfur, of burning pitch, and of ancient, decaying stone. It was the scent of the deep earth, violently exposed to the sky. The temperature in the valleys began to rise, ignoring the natural progression of the seasons. It was not the comforting, golden heat of the summer sun. It was a harsh, oppressive, radiant heat that seemed to seep up from the very bedrock. The leaves on the olive trees began to curl and brown at the edges. The small, crystal-clear streams that tumbled down from the high snowmelts began to shrink, their waters growing warm and carrying a strange, metallic taste. The animals of Lycia sensed the approaching doom long before the human inhabitants. The wild goats that usually danced along the highest, most dangerous precipices vanished entirely, retreating into the deepest, darkest caves. The birds ceased their singing, leaving the pine forests in an eerie, suffocating silence. The domestic dogs, usually brave guardians of the sheepfolds, whined and paced nervously, their tails tucked tightly between their legs, refusing to look toward the northern passes. A profound collective anxiety settled over the land, a heavy, suffocating blanket of apprehension. The earth itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the blow to fall. And then, the sky to the north began to change color. It was late afternoon when the first visual confirmation of the horror appeared. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the valleys. But above the jagged peaks of Mount Cragus, the sky was not the pale blue of evening. It was a bruised, sullen orange, thick with swirling clouds of dark, greasy smoke. The smoke did not dissipate in the upper atmosphere. It hung low and heavy, rolling down the slopes like a suffocating gray avalanche. As the sun sank lower, the source of the smoke became terrifyingly clear. A localized moving inferno was descending the mountain. The Lycian farmers, standing in their terraced fields, dropped their tools and stared upward in paralyzed disbelief. The sound reached them before the physical heat. It was a low, rhythmic vibration that resonated in the marrow of their bones. The heavy, crushing thud of the lion's paws striking the stone, followed by the terrifying, deafening roar of the goat's fire. It sounded like a massive, continuous rockslide accompanied by the howling of 1,000 furnaces. She emerged from the smoke like a demon tearing through the fabric of the world. The sheer scale of the Chimera, combined with the impossible speed of her descent, shattered the mind. The golden fur of the lion forefront was matted with soot and glowing with reflected heat. The goat head, rising monstrously from the spine, was a blinding, white-hot beacon in the gathering gloom. The creature did not simply walk down the mountain. She poured down it, a chaotic, fluid mass of muscle, scale, and flame. When she reached the tree line, the true, devastating power of her breath was revealed. The goat head swung in a wide, sweeping arc. The thick, viscous fire erupted from its jaws, washing over the ancient, resin-heavy cedar trees. The trees did not simply burn, they exploded. The intense heat instantly vaporized the sap within the trunks, causing the wood to shatter with the sound of cannon fire. Entire sections of the forest were reduced to glowing, skeletal embers in a matter of seconds. The fire spread with unnatural speed, driven by the creature's own roaring breath, consuming everything in its path. The Chimera reached the upper terraces of the farming valleys. The slaughter that followed was not a hunt. It was an act of pure, malicious eradication. The lion forefront crashed through the heavy, dry stone walls of the sheepfolds as if they were made of dry twigs. The massive iron claws dug into the earth, throwing up clouds of burning dirt and shattered rock. The lion did not pause to consume its prey. It merely crushed, snapping the spines of terrified cattle and sheep with casual, brutal efficiency. The golden eyes burned with an empty, alien hatred, driven by a rage that predated the existence of the mortal creatures it was destroying. While the lion crushed the life from the herds, the goat head focused on the land itself. The horizontal, dead yellow eyes of the goat scanned the neat, carefully cultivated rows of olive trees. The mouth opened, and the roaring torrent of divine fire washed over the groves. The silvery leaves turned black and dissolved into ash instantly. The ancient, twisted trunks, some of which had stood for centuries, caught fire and burned with a fierce, unnatural intensity, the oil within the wood acting as fuel for the demonic flame. The air was filled with the deafening roar of the combustion and the blinding, suffocating smoke of 1,000 burning orchards. and constantly, relentlessly, the serpent tail guarded the rear. As the desperate, panicked farmers tried to flee, or foolishly grabbed their bronze-tipped spears to defend their homes, the serpent struck from the smoke. The movement was a blur of dark, speckled scales. The long, venomous fangs sank into flesh, injecting a toxin so potent that it stopped the heart almost immediately. Those struck by the serpent did not burn. They collapsed into the hot ash, their veins turning black, their bodies turning cold, even as the surrounding valley became an unbearable furnace. The Chimera did not stop to rest. She moved through the valley in a continuous, chaotic frenzy of destruction. The heat radiating from her body was so intense that the roofs of the wooden houses spontaneously combusted as she passed by, bursting into flame without even being touched by the goat's breath. The small streams that watered the fields boiled away into hissing steam, leaving behind cracked, baked mud and the smell of sulfur. By the time the sun finally set, casting a deep, unnatural darkness over the land, the valley was unrecognizable. The lush, green paradise of Lycia had been transformed into a smoking, glowing hellscape. The air was thick with gray ash that fell like a macabre, silent snow. The silence of the night was broken only by the crackle of burning timbers and the distant, terrifying roar of the beast as she continued her march toward the next valley. The survivors, those few who had managed to scramble up the steepest, most inaccessible cliffs, looked down upon their ruined homes with eyes wide with a trauma that could not be articulated. They had lost their herds, their crops, their homes, and their families in the span of a single afternoon. But worse than the physical loss was the profound, shattering realization of their own complete impotence. They were mortal men, bound by the laws of physics and biology. They could not fight a creature that was a walking violation of those laws. They could not fight a beast that breathed the fire of the underworld. The Chimera did not merely pass through Lycia, she claimed it. She found the jagged, imposing peaks of Mount Cragus to her liking. The deep, shadowed ravines and the labyrinthine limestone caves provided the perfect lair for her massive, disjointed form. She established a territory of terror, a sprawling, blackened domain where no human dared to tread. Her presence fundamentally altered the ecosystem of the region. The lands immediately surrounding her mountainous lair became a dead zone. The constant, radiating heat baked the soil until it turned to hard, cracked ceramic. The rain, when it fell, sizzled and evaporated before it could penetrate the earth. The sky above Mount Cragus was perpetually stained with a dirty, yellow-brown haze of smoke and sulfurous gas. The sun, when seen through this toxic veil, appeared as a sickly, blood-red disk, offering no warmth, only a grim reminder of the fire that burned below. From her high vantage point on the mountain, the Chimera dictated the lives of the remaining Lycians. She would descend at irregular intervals, driven by an unpredictable, chaotic hunger. Sometimes she would hunt the remaining wild game, her lion jaws snapping the necks of giant boars, her serpent tail paralyzing deer mid-leap. Other times, she would simply descend to burn. She would wander into the lower valleys, setting fire to the scrub brush and the remaining isolated farms, her goat head roaring its devastating flame into the night sky, purely for the malicious joy of destruction. The terror she inspired was absolute and paralyzing. The Lycians abandoned the fertile interior valleys entirely, retreating to the very edge of the sea, building crude, fortified settlements on the rocky promontories. they lived in a state of constant, exhausting vigilance. The children were taught to sleep lightly and to never ever speak the name of the beast out loud, for fear that the sound of the syllables would draw her golden, burning eyes toward their fragile homes. The economy of Lycia collapsed. The olive groves were gone. The grain fields were vast tracts of gray ash. The trade ships that usually visited their ports to buy timber and oil stopped coming, warned away by the massive plume of black smoke that hung over the coastline, visible for miles out at sea. Lycia became a quarantined land, a cursed province, abandoned by the outside world, left to suffer the wrath of a monster that could not be reasoned with and could not be killed. The human cost was immeasurable. It was not just the lives lost to the fire, the claws, and the venom. It was the slow, agonizing death of hope. The Lycians were a pious people. They sacrificed their remaining scrawny animals to the high gods. They built altars on the beaches and poured dark wine into the sand, begging Zeus, the thunderer, or Apollo, the god of light, to strike down the abomination that had stolen their land. But the heavens remained silent. No thunderbolt fell from the sky. No divine arrow pierced the beast's tough hide. The Olympian gods, looking down from their high, pristine mountain, seemed entirely indifferent to the suffering of the mortals below. The Chimera was a creature of the deep, chaotic earth, a remnant of a time before the reign of the sky gods, and perhaps the sky gods were content to let the earth consume its own children. The burden of this devastating reality fell heavily upon the shoulders of the local ruler, King Iobates. He sat in his fortified palace near the coast, listening to the desperate, weeping pleas of his ruined subjects. He was a king without a kingdom, a ruler presiding over a realm of ash and fear. He knew that his mortal soldiers, with their bronze swords and wooden shields, were completely useless against the beast. To send an army up the slopes of Mount Cragus would be to order a mass suicide. The soldiers would burn in their armor before they ever got close enough to strike a blow. Iobates was trapped. He could not protect his people, and he could not abandon his throne. He lived with the constant, sickening knowledge that his entire civilization was slowly, inevitably, being erased from the face of the earth by a creature that defied all reason. The king grew old and bitter, his eyes constantly scanning the northern horizon, watching the dark smoke rise from the mountain, waiting for the day when the fire would finally descend upon his palace walls. But the legacy of the Chimera in Lycia was not merely a story of destruction. Her presence left a physical, geological scar upon the landscape that has endured for millennia, blurring the lines between myth and reality, between the terrifying poetry of the ancients and the cold facts of the natural world. Deep within the region where the Chimera made her lair, near the modern valley of Olympos, lies a place of profound and enduring mystery. The locals call it Yanartaş, the flaming rock. If you were to walk up the steep, pine-scented path today, leaving the ruins of the ancient cities behind, you would eventually reach a rocky, barren clearing on the side of the mountain. Here, the earth itself appears to be bleeding fire. From dozens of small, unassuming cracks and vents in the solid limestone bedrock, bright, dancing flames emerge. These fires do not burn wood or brush. They burn the very air. They are fueled by a deep, subterranean reservoir of methane gas, slowly seeping up through the porous stone from the dark depths of the earth. These fires are eternal. They burn through the heat of the summer and the torrential rains of the winter. They have been burning continuously for at least 3,000 years. The ancient sailors, navigating the treacherous coastline at night, used these natural, unquenchable flames as a lighthouse, a fiery beacon warning them of the rocky shores. To the ancient Lycians, and to the generations that followed, Yanartaş was not a geological anomaly. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of the monster's existence. The eternal flames were the dying, subterranean breath of the Chimera. They believed that even though the physical body of the beast might have been driven deep underground, her fiery essence, the dread might of the blazing fire inherited from Typhon, could not be extinguished. When you stand on the slopes of Yanartaş at night, with the wind whispering through the dark pines and the shadows dancing erratically in the light of the eternal flames, it is impossible not to feel the weight of the myth. The smell of sulfur hangs heavy in the air. The stone beneath your feet is warm to the touch. The quiet crackle of the fire sounds like a slow, rhythmic exhalation from a creature sleeping fitfully in the cavernous dark below. The fires of Yanartaş serve as a permanent, burning monument to the terror that once ruled this land. They are a physical connection to the ancient anxiety, a reminder that the earth is not solid, that the ground beneath our feet hides violent, combustible secrets. They are the lingering ghost of the goat's head, still breathing its defiance into the cool night air, long after the lion has fallen silent and the serpent has turned to dust. The Chimera had transformed Lycia into a kingdom of ash and despair. She had established her unbreakable dominion over the mountains, and her fire had become a permanent feature of the geography. She was an insurmountable problem, a nightmare that could not be woken from. The mortal men of Lycia had failed. Their weapons were useless. Their prayers were unanswered. The beast was absolute. But the cosmos of the ancient Greeks demanded balance. A monster of impossible proportions requires a hero of impossible circumstances. The solution to the problem of Lycia would not come from the terrorized farmers or the despairing king. It would come from across the sea, from a man burdened by his own dark history, a man who had no intention of becoming a savior, but who was driven by the inescapable currents of fate and the treacherous political maneuverings of the civilized world. The story must now shift away from the burning mountains and the smoking ash. We must leave the deafening roar of the beast and travel to the quiet marble halls of a distant kingdom. We must look at the human element of this equation. We must trace the path of a reluctant warrior, an exiled rider who carried a folded tablet containing his own death warrant, unknowingly walking toward a confrontation that would define the limits of human courage and the terrifying consequences of divine hubris. The fire is burning. The trap is set. The sky above Mount Cragus waits, heavy and silent, for the arrival of the wings that will finally challenge the flame. Far from the suffocating ash of the burning mountains, across the vast, glittering expanse of the Aegean Sea, the world was still a place of cool marble, running water, and structured human ambition. The air here did not smell of sulfur and roasted earth. It smelled of sea salt, blooming myrtle, and the fragrant smoke of temple incense. This was the city of Ephyra, a wealthy, sprawling settlement that would later be known to history as Corinth. It sat proudly upon the narrow neck of land separating two great seas, a city of merchants, horse breeders, and ancient kings. In this city of high walls and deep, cold springs, a young man walked under the shadow of a profound, inescapable darkness. His given name was Hipponos, the son of the mortal king Glaucus, and the grandson of the legendary, cunning Sisyphus. He was born into the highest echelon of the ancient nobility, a youth endowed by the gods with a flawless, striking beauty, and a natural, quiet valor. His shoulders were broad, his hands were steady, and his eyes possessed the clear, unclouded gaze of a man destined to lead armies. He was a prince of the horse-taming city, surrounded by wealth and the adoration of his people. Yet, destiny in the ancient world is rarely a straight, sunlit path. It is often a sudden, brutal plunge into the abyss. The tragedy did not arrive with the roar of a monster, but with the sickening, quiet thud of an accident. The ancient records of Apollodorus speak of a fatal moment, a blur of unintended violence in the shadows of the palace. The young prince struck a blow, perhaps in a training exercise, perhaps in a moment of confused, youthful passion. The specifics are lost to the grinding dust of time, but the result was absolute. A man lay dead at his feet. Some ancient singers claim the victim was his own brother, Iliad. Others whisper it was a nobleman of the city named Bellerophon. Regardless of the victim's identity, the blood was spilled, and the young prince's life was irrevocably shattered. From that moment, he shed his given name and assumed a title of grim, perpetual guilt. He became Bellerophon, the slayer of Bellerus. To understand the horror of this moment, one must understand the ancient Greek concept of miasma. Miasma was not merely a feeling of guilt or a legal standing. It was a physical, spiritual pollution. It was a heavy, invisible stain that clung to the skin of the murderer, a toxic shadow that infected everything he touched. To carry the blood guilt was to be entirely severed from the grace of the gods. The earth itself rejected the feet of the polluted man. The crops would fail if he walked through the fields. The water would sour if he drank from the communal wells. The city of Ephyra, his home, his birthright, turned its collective back on him. The silence of the citizens as he walked the streets was louder than any screaming accusation. Bellerophon had no choice. The law of the ancient world demanded exile. He gathered a small, tight bundle of belongings, draped a heavy woolen cloak over his broad shoulders, and walked out of the massive gates of Ephyra, looking down at the dust of the road, unable to meet the eyes of the guards. He became a wanderer, a ghost haunting the dirt roads of the Peloponnese. The physical journey was grueling, but the psychological weight was crushing. He slept under the cold, indifferent stars, listening to the howling of the wolves, feeling the profound, terrifying isolation of a man entirely cut off from human society. The beauty the gods had given him felt like a cruel mockery beneath the heavy layers of road dust and dried sweat. He was a vessel of spiritual sickness, seeking a cure that only a king could provide. His wandering steps eventually led him south, to the fertile plains of Argos, to the heavily fortified gates of Tiryns. Here ruled King Proetus, a monarch of immense power and wealth. Bellerophon approached the palace as a suppliant. He did not come as a proud prince, but as a broken man, kneeling in the dirt before the hearth of the king, holding the olive branch wrapped in wool, silently begging for the rite of purification. Proetus, recognizing the noble bearing hidden beneath the dirt and the sorrow, accepted the suppliant. The ritual of cleansing was an ancient, somber affair. The smell of burning thyme and frankincense filled the dark, stone-walled chamber. The blood of a freshly slaughtered, unblemished piglet was carefully poured over Bellerophon's hands, the warm, innocent blood washing away the cold, invisible stain of the murder. Holy water, drawn from a sacred, flowing spring, was then splashed over his head and shoulders. Prayers were chanted to Zeus the Purifier, begging the king of the gods to lift the miasma, to sever the invisible chains of the blood guilt. When Bellerophon finally stood, he took his first deep, unburdened breath in months. He was clean. The crushing weight was gone. He was welcomed into the court of Pegasus as an honored guest, a resident alien under the direct, sacred protection of the king. For a time, the halls of Argos offered a quiet, healing sanctuary. Bellerophon proved his worth, displaying his quiet valor and his skill with horses, earning the deep respect of Pegasus. The king looked upon the young exile as a trusted companion, perhaps even a surrogate son. The ancient laws of hospitality, the sacred bond of Xenia, tied them together. A host must protect his guest with his life, and a guest must never, under any circumstances, bring harm or dishonor to the house of the host. It was a code enforced by the very lightning bolts of the highest gods. But sanctuary is a fragile illusion, easily shattered by the darker impulses of the human heart. The threat in Argos did not come from outside the thick stone walls. It came from the deepest, most private chambers of the palace. It came from Queen Antea. Homer tells us that the queen, observing the young, newly purified exile from the shadowed balconies of the courtyard, was struck by a sudden, consuming madness. Bellerophon was possessed of a breathtaking, divine beauty, a physical perfection that had only been hardened and refined by his suffering on the road. Antea watched him train with the heavy bronze spears in the afternoon sun. She watched the way he spoke with the quiet dignity of a man who had known absolute ruin. A dark, obsessive lust took root in her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a poisonous vine. She did not act immediately. The quiet atmosphere of the palace became thick with unsaid words and lingering glances. Antea was a creature of subtle power, moving silently through the torch-lit corridors, her heavy, perfumed silks rustling softly against the stone floors. She engineered moments of isolation, finding herself alone with the young exile in the cool, shaded colonnades when the rest of the court was sleeping through the heat of the day. Her approach was a whispered poison. She spoke of her loneliness, of the coldness of her royal marriage, of the power she could offer a young man far from his home. She offered him her bed, her absolute devotion, and a secret share of the kingdom. It was a temptation designed to break the will of a desperate, landless exile. Bellerophon listened, the blood freezing in his veins. He understood the catastrophic danger of the situation instantly. He was a man who had only recently been cleansed of a terrible stain. He knew the wrath of the gods intimately. To accept the queen's proposition would not just be a betrayal of his own honor. It would be a direct, unforgivable violation of the sacred law of hospitality. To defile the marriage bed of the man who had poured the purifying blood over his hands, the man who had saved him from the road, was a crime worse than the accidental murder he had already committed. He refused her. He did not shout, nor did he humiliate her, but his rejection was absolute, cold, and unwavering. He turned his back on the Queen of Argos, preferring the honorable poverty of an exile to the luxurious, damning embrace of a traitor. He walked away, hoping his silence would bury the secret. He profoundly underestimated the destructive power of a bruised ego. Antaia's lust curdled instantly into a black, venomous hatred. She watched him walk away, her hands trembling, her face pale with the shock of rejection. The silence of the palace felt mocking. If she could not have him, she would destroy him utterly, and she would use the very laws he held so sacred to do it. That night, in the deepest hours of darkness, when the palace was completely silent, save for the distant crashing of the waves, Antaea went to the private chambers of King Proetus. She tore the fine linen of her own garments. She scored her cheeks with her fingernails until they bled. She threw herself at the feet of her husband, weeping with perfectly manufactured hysterical terror. She spun a lie so massive, so profoundly damaging, that it demanded immediate, lethal retribution. She whispered into the darkness that the trusted guest, the beautiful exile they had welcomed into their home, had attempted to take her by force. She claimed Bellerophon had cornered her in the shadows, his eyes burning with unnatural lust, trying to violate the sacred sanctity of the royal household. "Either die yourself, Proetus," she wept, her voice trembling with venomous conviction, "or kill Bellerophon, who wanted to lie with me in love against my will." The king sat up in his bed, the cold night air suddenly feeling suffocating. A blind, roaring anger filled his chest. The man he had saved, the youth he had trusted, had attempted to defile his wife and destroy his honor. His first overwhelming instinct was to grab the heavy bronze sword resting near his bed, to march down the stone corridor to the guest quarters, and to sever the head of the traitor while he slept. But as Proetus reached for the weapon, a heavy, paralyzing dread stayed his hand. The laws of the gods are complex, often weaving a suffocating net around the actions of mortal men. The king was trapped in an impossible, agonizing paradox. Bellerophon was his guest. They had shared bread. They had shared salt. Proetus had personally overseen the purification rituals. To draw the blood of a guest within his own walls, even a guest accused of the most heinous crime, would invoke the immediate, devastating wrath of Zeus Xenios, the protector of strangers. If Proetus killed Bellerophon, the miasma, the very pollution he had washed away from the boy, would instantly transfer to his own hands. His kingdom would be cursed. His crops would fail. The Furies would hound his every step. He paced the dark chamber, the heavy footsteps echoing like a ticking clock, his mind desperately seeking a solution. He could not kill the boy, but he absolutely could not let him live. The insult demanded blood, but the blood could not stain the floors of Argos. The solution he devised was a masterpiece of cold, political cruelty. He would not wield the blade himself. He would use the vast, expanding networks of the ancient world to execute his vengeance from afar. He would turn the young exile into the unwitting instrument of his own execution. The next morning, the atmosphere in the palace was thick, heavy, and strained. Proetus summoned Bellerophon to the throne room. The king's face was a mask of carved stone, hiding the seething anger beneath a veneer of formal, terrifying courtesy. He did not mention the accusation. He did not mention the tears of the queen. Instead, he spoke of an urgent diplomatic mission. He told the young exile that he required a messenger of the utmost trust, a man of noble blood to carry a vital communication across the sea. The destination was the distant, sun-drenched land of Lycia, the realm ruled by King Iobates. Iobates was a powerful monarch. He was also, crucially, the father of Queen Antea. Proetus was sending the accused directly to the father of the supposed victim. Proetus handed Bellerophon a small, sealed object. The blind poet Homer calls it a folded tablet, containing baneful signs, magical, deadly marks carved into the soft wax. This was an era before widespread literacy, a time when writing itself was considered a dark, mystical art. Bellerophon, a warrior and a prince, could not read the scratches hidden inside the folded wood. He accepted the burden with a solemn nod, honored by the trust the king was placing in him, completely unaware that he was holding his own death warrant. The tablet was sealed tight, bound with cord and marked with the heavy, undeniable signet of the king of Argos. The message inside was simple, absolute, and utterly devoid of mercy. It requested that King Iobates, upon reading the signs, immediately execute the bearer of the tablet to avenge the attempted assault on his daughter. Bellerophon tucked the small, heavy wooden boards into the folds of his tunic, resting them directly over his heart. He said his farewells to the court of Argos. He did not see Queen Antea watching him from the high, shadowed balcony, a cold, satisfied smile playing across her lips as she watched him walk toward the harbor. He secured passage on a dark-prowed trading ship heading east. The sails caught the wind. The heavy, bronze-tipped oars dipped rhythmically into the sea, and the shoreline of the Peloponnese slowly faded into the blue haze of the horizon. The journey across the Aegean was a time of quiet reflection. The rhythmic creaking of the wooden hull, the sharp smell of the salt spray, and the vast, unbroken expanse of the sea offered a temporary, peaceful suspension of reality. Bellerophon stood at the prow of the ship, the wind tearing at his hair, looking toward the rising sun. He felt a sense of purpose. He was a trusted emissary now, a man of consequence, carrying the words of a great king. The heavy burden of the folded tablet pressing against his chest felt like an anchor of honor, a tether to the civilized world he had so desperately sought to rejoin. He could not know that with every stroke of the oars, with every nautical mile the ship traveled eastward, he was drawing closer to a landscape of pure, unimaginable terror. For 9 days, the ship sailed the wine-dark waters. The weather held fair, the winds blowing favorably at their backs, guided by the unseen hands of the very gods who had orchestrated this tragic journey. On the horizon of the 10th day, the jagged, towering peaks of the Taurus Mountains finally pierced the sky. As the ship drew closer to the coastline, the sailors began to murmur nervously among themselves. The sky above the mountains did not look right. The pristine blue of the Mediterranean heaven was stained with a dirty, lingering smudge of brown and gray. As they rode into the deep water of the Lycian Bay, the smell of the air changed. The clean scent of the ocean was suddenly overpowered by a harsh chemical odor, the smell of burning pitch, the smell of sulfur. Bellerophon disembarked at the bustling port, his hand resting instinctively on the hilt of his sword. The atmosphere in the city was strange, heavy with an unspoken, collective anxiety. The people hurried through the streets, their heads bowed, casting nervous glances toward the northern peaks. But the young exile had a mission. He asked for directions to the palace of King Iobates, his fingers tracing the outline of the folded tablet beneath his tunic. The court of Lycia was a place of fading grandeur. The high stone walls were solid, the marble floors were polished, but the air inside the palace felt tense, like the atmosphere immediately preceding a massive thunderstorm. King Iobates received the stranger with the customary, unquestioning grace of the ancient world. The laws of hospitality were just as binding here as they were in Argos. A stranger arriving at the hearth must be treated with the utmost respect. He must be fed, he must be bathed, and he must be entertained before any questions are asked of his identity or his business. For 9 continuous days, the king of Lycia hosted the young exile. It was a surreal, deeply uncomfortable period of forced celebration. Every evening, massive, roaring fires were built in the center of the great hall. The servants brought out heavy platters of roasted oxen, sheep, and wild boar. The finest, darkest wines, cut with spring water, were poured freely into deep golden cups. The court musicians plucked their lyres, singing ancient songs of heroes and gods, their voices struggling to cut through the heavy, oppressive mood of the room. Bellerophon sat at the right hand of the king, eating the rich food, drinking the sweet wine, and observing his surroundings. He could see the strain on the faces of the Lycian nobility. He could see the way the king's eyes would drift toward the high, open windows facing the north. Though no one spoke of it, the reality of their situation was impossible to ignore. In the quiet moments between the songs, when the wind shifted, the faint, distant sound of a roaring fire could be heard echoing down from the mountains. The faint smell of ash drifted through the open colonnades, settling like gray snow on the rim of the golden wine cups. They were feasting in the shadow of the apocalypse. They were pouring wine while their country burned. Iobates played the role of the perfect host, hiding his own despair behind a mask of regal courtesy. He found the young stranger to be engaging, respectful, and clearly of noble, heroic stock. The king felt a genuine warmth toward the boy. But the requirements of hospitality have a strict time limit. On the morning of the 10th day, as the rosy fingers of dawn crept across the sky, painting the smoke over the mountains in shades of angry red and deep violet, the feasting came to an end. The king summoned Bellerophon to his private chambers. The air was cool and quiet. "You have graced my halls for 9 days, stranger," Iobates said, his voice deep and weary. "We have shared the meat and the wine. Now, the time for silence has passed. Tell me your name, your lineage, and what brings you across the vast sea to the shores of Lycia. Do you carry a token from the lands of the west?" Bellerophon stepped forward, a proud, honorable light in his eyes. He reached deep into the folds of his tunic. He pulled out the small, heavy wooden boards, still tightly bound and sealed with the unbroken wax of King Proetus. "I am Bellerophon, son of Glaucus," he said, holding out the lethal package. "I come as an emissary from the great King Proetus of Argos. I bring you his words, sealed in this tablet." Iobates took the tablet. He recognized the seal of his son-in-law immediately. A small smile of anticipation touched his lips. He expected news of his daughter, news of the kingdom of Argos, perhaps a treaty of trade or a simple greeting between allied houses. He broke the wax seal. The cord fell away. He opened the folded boards. His eyes scanned the jagged, carved symbols hidden within the wood. The room was perfectly, suffocatingly silent. Bellerophon stood tall, waiting for the king to smile, waiting for the warm welcome of an allied monarch acknowledging a successful diplomatic delivery. Instead, he watched as the blood drained completely from the face of King Iobates. He watched the older man's hands begin to tremble violently. The wooden boards rattled together like dry bones. The king's eyes widened, moving back and forth across the baneful signs, reading the horrific accusation, reading the explicit, undeniable demand for the immediate execution of the young man standing before him. The king looked up. He looked at the beautiful, proud, trusting face of the young exile. He looked down at the tablet. Iobates was suddenly caught in the exact same, inescapable trap that had paralyzed Protus. The demand was clear. He must kill this boy to avenge the honor of his own daughter. It was his absolute duty as a father. But to kill him now, after 9 days of feasting, after breaking bread, sharing wine, and formally welcoming him to the hearth, it was impossible. The young man was a guest. He was protected by the unbreakable laws of Zeus. If Iobates ordered his guards to strike down Bellerophon in the palace, the wrath of the gods would descend upon Lycia, multiplying the horrors they were already suffering. The king could not execute him, and he could not let him go. Iobates closed the tablet, his mind racing with desperate, terrifying calculations. He needed the boy to die, but he needed the death to occur far away from the palace walls. He needed the blood to be on the hands of someone or something else. He walked slowly to the high, arched window of his chamber. He looked out toward the northern horizon. The dirty, yellow-brown smoke hung thick over the jagged peaks of Mount Cragus. He thought of the ruined valleys. He thought of the blackened olive groves. He thought of the unkillable, fire-breathing nightmare that was slowly erasing his kingdom. An idea formed in the dark, desperate corners of the king's mind. A solution of absolute, cold-blooded efficiency. He would send the boy to do the impossible. He would disguise an execution as a heroic quest. Iobates turned back to face the young, expectant warrior. The mask of the gracious host slid back perfectly into place, though his voice lacked its former warmth. "The message from Protus is heavy, young prince," Iobates lied smoothly, tucking the fatal tablet into his robes. "He speaks highly of your unmatched valor. He claims you are a warrior without equal in the western lands, and it seems the gods have sent you to us in our darkest hour." The king pointed a trembling finger toward the open window, toward the dark, smoking mountains. "My kingdom is dying, Bellerophon. We are being consumed by an abomination, a creature of impossible terror. A lion in front, a serpent behind, a goat in the middle, breathing the roaring fire of the underworld. She has burned our crops, slaughtered our herds, and driven my people to the edge of madness." Iobates stepped closer, placing a heavy hand on the young exile's shoulder, sealing the trap. "I cannot offer you the peaceful rest of an emissary. If you are truly the hero Proetus claims you to be, I command you to ride out. I command you to climb the slopes of Mount Cragus. I command you to slay the unslayable Chimera." Bellerophon looked out the window. He saw the smoke. He felt the distant, unnatural heat pressing against the cool morning air. He was a mortal man, armed only with a bronze sword and a wooden shield. He was being asked to walk directly into the open mouth of a walking volcano. He did not know of the lie. He did not know he was carrying his own death warrant. He only knew the strict code of honor, the duty of a guest to aid his host, and the deep, abiding need to prove his worth to a world that had cast him out. He gave a slow, solemn nod. He accepted the impossible task. The young rider would soon leave the safety of the marble halls. He would walk toward the fire. But as he looked up at the vast, empty sky above the smoke, he realized a fundamental, terrifying truth. A man on the ground, wielding a heavy bronze spear, could not fight a creature that breathed walls of flame. The heat would melt his armor and turn his lungs to ash before he could even close the distance. To kill the fire, he could not walk upon the earth. He needed to find a way to strike from the cold, unreachable heights of the clouds. He needed a miracle. He needed to find a creature just as impossible, just as mythical, as the monster he was sent to destroy. The search for the sky-born steed was about to begin. To stand upon the solid earth and look toward the smoking peaks of Mount Cragus was to understand the cold, absolute mathematics of mortality. The young exile, carrying the weight of a secret death warrant and the heavy expectations of a desperate king, understood the physical impossibility of the task laid before him. A man bound by the laws of gravity cannot fight a walking inferno on its own terms. If he were to march up the craggy, ash-covered slopes on foot, armed with a heavy, bronze-tipped spear and a shield of thick oxhide, the battle would be decided long before he ever came within striking distance of the beast. The ambient temperature surrounding the Chimera was a localized, suffocating hell. His bronze greaves and breastplate, designed to deflect the blows of mortal weapons, would quickly transform into an unbearable, searing oven against his skin. The dry, ash-choked air would sear his lungs with every desperate breath, and the long wooden shaft of his ash-wood spear would simply spontaneously combust, turning to useless, crumbling charcoal before the iron tip could ever hope to pierce the monster's thick, serpentine scales or its coarse, golden pelt. The Chimera possessed the ultimate high ground. She ruled the rugged verticality of the Lycian mountains, raining unquenchable, divine fire down upon the valleys. To defeat an enemy that weaponizes the very terrain and the air itself, one must completely remove the terrain from the equation. One must abandon the earth entirely. The young rider knew he needed to ascend. He needed to strike from the cold, thin, unreachable heights of the clouds, diving down upon the monster with the speed and sudden violence of a thunderbolt. He needed a mount that did not fear the steep ravines, a steed that did not require the solid rock beneath its hooves. He required a creature woven from the same impossible, primordial magic as the nightmare he was sent to destroy. He needed to find the sky-born steed. He needed the immortal winged horse. The existence of such a creature was a whispered legend among the horse tamers of the ancient world, a myth born from violence, blood, and the dark edges of the uncharted earth. The poet Hesiod, chronicler of the divine generations, recorded the terrifying, miraculous origins of this airborne beast. Long before the current age of men, on the absolute misty fringes of the world, where the great eternal river Oceanus circles the earth, a dark and monumental act of violence had occurred. the hero Perseus, guided by divine favor, had sought out the isolated rocky island of the Gorgons. These were monstrous sisters with hands of brass, wings of gold, and heads covered in writhing, venomous serpents. The most famous of these sisters, the only one cursed with mortality, was Medusa. Her gaze possessed the heavy, petrifying power to turn any living flesh instantly into cold, unyielding stone. When Perseus struck the fatal, decapitating blow, separating the horrific, snake-crowned head from the neck of the Gorgon, the result was not merely a mortal death. Medusa, in her youth, had lain with the dark-haired god of the sea, Poseidon, the earth-shaker and the lord of horses. The divine seed of the ocean god had remained dormant within her, trapped by her monstrous curse. As the dark, thick blood poured from her severed neck, spilling out onto the barren rocks and pooling near the crashing, salty waves of the ocean, a profound biological miracle took place. The blood of the monster, mingling with the spray of the sea and the latent divine energy of Poseidon, began to bubble and churn. From this dark, crimson pool of death and salt, two fully formed, magnificent beings sprang instantly into the light of the sun. One was a warrior named Chrysaor, born gripping a heavy golden sword. The other was a creature of absolute, breathtaking majesty. A massive, powerful horse, its coat gleaming with an ethereal, unearthly light, possessing a pair of vast, feathered wings folded tightly against its muscular flanks. Because he was born beside the rushing springs of the great river Oceanus, they named him Pegasus. Pegasus did not linger on the dark, blood-stained rocks of his birth. He was a creature of the high ether, rejecting the heavy, polluted earth. He immediately unfurled his massive wings, feathers as long as a man's arm, strong enough to beat against the fiercest gales, and launched himself into the sky. He flew upward, leaving the realm of monsters and mortal men behind, ascending directly to the immortal, snow-capped peaks of Mount Olympus. There, he took residence in the high, golden halls of the gods, serving the ultimate power in the cosmos. Pegasus became the bearer of the storm, the chosen steed entrusted to carry the terrifying thunder and the jagged, white-hot lightning bolts of Zeus himself. To seek out such a creature was an act of profound, almost suicidal hubris for a mortal man. Pegasus was wild, untamed, and entirely divine. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the storm cloud and the gale. No mortal rope could bind him. No mortal hand could force a bit between his teeth. He answered only to the sky. Yet, the young exile, burdened by his impossible quest and the burning urgency of the Lycian king's command, sought out the ancient, hidden wisdom of the seers. He sought the counsel of a prophet, a man whose eyes looked past the physical world and into the complex, shifting currents of divine will. The ancient odes of Pindar, the singer of athletic glory and heroic triumph, tell us that the young warrior consulted Polyidus, a seer of immense and quiet power. The prophet listened to the desperate plan. He saw the cold, determined light in the young man's eyes, the quiet valor that had survived the crushing weight of exile and false accusations. Polyidus understood that mortal strength and mortal courage were entirely insufficient for this endeavor. A man cannot wrestle a hurricane, and a man cannot simply leap onto the back of the thunder-bearer. The seer offered a path, but it was a path of deep, spiritual submission. He instructed the young warrior to return to the sacred, familiar ground of his youth, to the city of his birth, Corinth. There, he must seek out the temple of the goddess who governs both the bloody violence of war and the cool, calculating clarity of strategic wisdom. He must approach the altar of Athena. "You cannot conquer the sky-born steed with force," the ancient seer advised, his voice a low, gravelly whisper in the dim light of his sanctuary. "You must bind him with grace. You must sleep upon the cold stone of the goddess's temple. You must offer her your complete, unresisting mind. Only the gray-eyed daughter of Zeus can provide the heavy, golden instrument of control." The journey back across the sea was a time of intense, inward focus. The young exile was no longer just a messenger carrying a wooden tablet. He was a man preparing to bridge the terrifying gap between the mortal earth and the immortal sky. Upon reaching the high, fortified walls of Corinth, he did not seek out the grand palaces or the bustling, noisy markets. He walked silently through the streets of his former home, a ghost returning to the site of his deepest sorrow, moving directly toward the sacred precinct. The Temple of Athena was a place of stark, intimidating beauty. Massive columns of pale, flawless marble supported a heavy, shadowed roof. The air inside the sanctuary was perpetually cool, smelling intensely of burning laurel leaves, crushed myrrh, and the ancient, metallic tang of the sacrificial bronze resting upon the high altar. The interior was shrouded in a deep, reverent gloom, illuminated only by the flickering, dancing light of several large oil lamps hanging from the ceiling. The young warrior approached the altar with slow, deliberate steps. He brought a magnificent, unblemished bull, its horns gilded with gold leaf, leading the massive animal to the sacred stone. With a swift, practiced strike, he offered the life of the beast to the goddess, pouring the dark, hot blood over the altar, a heavy, iron-scented sacrifice to draw the attention of the divine. He poured rich, dark wine into the fire, watching the flames leap upward, consuming the offering, sending the fragrant smoke rising into the dark, wooden rafters of the temple. The ritual of incubation demanded absolute vulnerability. The seeker must lie down within the sacred precinct, resting his body upon the newly flayed, still-warm fleece of the sacrificed animal. He must close his eyes to the waking world and open his mind completely to the shifting, unpredictable realm of dreams, hoping that the deity would choose to step across the threshold and deliver a message. He lay down upon the stone floor. The marble was unyielding, a cold, hard reminder of his mortal fragility. The thick, woolly fleece beneath him smelled of earth and blood. He closed his eyes, his mind swirling with the terrifying images of the roaring, fire-breathing monster in Lycia, the jagged, burning peaks of Mount Cragus, and the impossible, feathered silhouette of the winged horse. The silence of the temple deepened. The crackle of the altar fire slowly faded into a low, rhythmic hum. The physical world began to dissolve, slipping away into the heavy, suffocating darkness of a deep, exhaustion-fueled sleep. In the absolute center of the night, when the air is stillest, and the barrier between the human mind and the divine ether is thinnest, the atmosphere within the dream shifted. It was not a sudden, violent intrusion, but a slow, profound manifestation of an overwhelming presence. The darkness of the dream was suddenly illuminated by a cool, piercing silver light. From the shadows, a figure emerged. She did not walk. She seemed to simply materialize, commanding the space with absolute, effortless authority. It was the goddess Athena. She was dressed in the full, terrifying panoply of war, yet she radiated a calm, chilling intellect. Her helmet, pushed back to reveal her face, gleamed with the polished perfection of immortal bronze. The aegis, the legendary goatskin cloak bordered with writhing, hissing serpents, rested upon her shoulders, bearing the petrifying severed visage of the Gorgon Medusa dead center upon her chest, a stark, terrifying reminder of the violence that had birthed the very horse the young man sought. Her eyes, a striking, luminous gray, fixed upon the sleeping mortal. They were eyes that had watched empires crumble, eyes that calculated the precise geometry of battle lines and the inevitable, crushing weight of fate. "Are you sleeping?" King descended from Iolus. Her voice echoed in the cavernous space of his mind. It was a voice that sounded like the ringing of a perfectly tuned bronze bell, clear, resonant, and vibrating with an ancient, inescapable power. She did not offer him a spear to pierce the beast's hide. She did not offer him a shield to deflect the unquenchable fire. She offered him something infinitely more profound. She offered him the mechanism of discipline. The goddess raised her hand. From her elegant, immortal fingers dangled an object of immense, heavy beauty. It was a headstall, a complex arrangement of thick, supple leather straps, culminating in a severe, meticulously crafted metal bit. But the metal was not iron, nor was it ordinary bronze. It was solid, gleaming gold. "Come," the gray-eyed goddess commanded softly. "Take this charm to soothe the steed. Show it to your father, the Earth Shaker, and sacrifice a white bull to the Lord of the Deep Sea." She dropped the heavy, golden artifact. The moment the gold touched his hands in the dream, a violent shock snapped him back into the waking world. The young warrior gasped, his eyes flying open, his chest heaving as if he had just breached the surface of a deep, freezing ocean. He was lying on the hard marble floor of the temple. The oil lamps had burned low, casting long, wavering shadows across the silent columns. The smell of the sacrificed bull and the burning laurel was still heavy in the cold morning air. He slowly lifted his hands from his chest. It had not been merely a vision. It was a physical, undeniable manifestation of divine intervention. Resting in his palms, cold, heavy, and glinting softly in the dim light of the dying lamps, was the golden bridle. He ran his calloused fingers over the artifact, feeling the impossible perfection of the craftsmanship. The leather straps were incredibly thick, yet flexible, completely devoid of any signs of wear or age. The golden bit, designed to rest upon the sensitive bars of a horse's mouth, was severe, heavy, and imposing, a tool engineered to communicate absolute unyielding command to a creature of immense, chaotic power. This was the invention of Athena Chalanitis, Athena the Bridler. It was the physical embodiment of reason and discipline imposed upon the wild, untamed forces of nature. He rose from the cold stone floor, gripping the golden bridle tightly in his fist. He performed the required sacrifices, offering a pure white bull to Poseidon, acknowledging the complex, interconnected web of divine lineage and obligation. His mind was clear. The paralyzing dread of the impossible task had been replaced by a sharp, focused determination. He possessed the tool. Now he only needed to find the beast. The ancient legends of Corinth spoke of a specific, sacred location, where the winged horse occasionally descended from the high ether to touch the mortal earth. It was the spring of Perrine. Located near the towering, heavily fortified citadel of the Acra Corinth, the spring was a place of profound, quiet beauty. The water here did not merely bubble from the ground. It flowed clear, cold, and endlessly from deep, hidden fissures in the ancient rock. The surrounding stones were covered in a thick, vibrant carpet of green moss, nourished by the perpetual mist of the rushing water. The air was cool, smelling of wet earth and sweet blooming oleander. It was an oasis of tranquility, a small, pristine fragment of the wild world preserved just outside the bustling walls of the city. The young rider arrived at the spring long before the break of dawn. The sky was still a deep, bruised purple, the stars fading slowly as the eastern horizon began to lighten. He found a concealed position behind a massive, moss-draped boulder overlooking the main pool of the spring. He settled into the damp earth, wrapping his heavy woolen cloak around his shoulders to ward off the pre-dawn chill. He held the golden bridle in his lap, the cold metal pressing against his thighs, and he waited. The waiting was a grueling, agonizing test of endurance and focus. The ancient texts do not say how many days or nights he crouched behind the stone. He became a fixture of the landscape, ignoring the gnawing hunger in his belly and the stiff, aching cramps in his muscles. He breathed slowly, shallowly, tuning his ears to the subtle sounds of the environment, the rhythmic dripping of the water, the rustle of the wind through the oleander leaves, the distant call of a night bird. He was a predator waiting in perfect, absolute ambush, not to kill, but to capture a piece of the sky. It was mid-morning. The sun was high, casting bright, dappled light through the canopy of the surrounding trees. The air was warm and entirely still. Suddenly, the stillness was shattered. It began as a sound, a low, rhythmic, rushing noise, like the approach of a sudden, fierce squall over the open ocean. The wind in the clearing violently changed direction, whipping the leaves of the oleander bushes into a frenzy. The surface of the calm, clear spring water rippled and churned, disturbed by a massive, unseen downdraft. The young warrior slowly looked up, his grip tightening instinctively on the golden bridle. Descending from the blinding blue vault of the sky was a creature of absolute, staggering magnificence. Pegasus did not fall. He drifted downward with the terrifying, majestic grace of an apex predator of the air. His wings were incredibly vast, stretching wider than a fishing boat, covered in thick, pristine white feathers that caught the sunlight and reflected it with an almost blinding, ethereal glow. The wind roared through the primary feathers as he angled his massive body, backpedaling against the air resistance to slow his descent. His coat was the color of fresh, untouched snow, rippling over deep, powerful layers of muscle, designed to propel a heavy, equine body through the thin atmosphere. His mane and tail whipped wildly in the downdraft he created, with a heavy, resonant thud that vibrated through the damp earth. The winged horse landed beside the edge of the pool. He folded his massive wings slowly, meticulously, tucking the long, white feathers tightly against his flanks. He lowered his beautiful, sculpted head, his velvet muzzle skimming the surface of the cold, clear water. He drank deeply, the rhythmic sound of his swallowing echoing loudly in the sudden, awed silence of the clearing. The young rider knew this was the only moment he would ever have. If the horse startled, if those massive wings caught the wind, he would be gone, ascending back to the halls of Zeus, leaving the mortal stranded with a useless piece of gold. He rose from behind the boulder. He did not run. He did not make a sudden, aggressive movement. he stepped out into the open, moving with an excruciating, slow fluidity, completely exposed to the gaze of the immortal beast. Pegasus stopped drinking. The horse lifted his head, water dripping from his muzzle, his ears swiveling forward, locking onto the approaching human. The large, dark eyes of the winged steed were unreadable, alien, filled with the wild, untamed essence of the high ether. The horse snorted, a sharp, explosive sound, his powerful muscles tensing, preparing to launch himself back into the safety of the sky. But then, the young warrior raised his hands, lifting the heavy, golden headstall into the shaft of the morning sunlight. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The golden metal flared brilliantly. It was not merely the reflection of the sun, it was the resonance of divine authority. The bridle, forged by the goddess of wisdom, carried a weight, an invisible, commanding aura that the immortal horse recognized immediately. It was the physical manifestation of order, a divine mandate requesting submission. Pegasus did not rear up. He did not strike out with his heavy, lethal hooves. The tension slowly drained from his massive frame. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the gleaming gold. The young exile closed the final distance. The smell of the horse was overwhelming. A clean, sharp scent, smelling of ozone, high-altitude cold, and the salt of the distant ocean from which he was born. With slow, reverent hands, the rider reached up. He did not grab the horse's mane. He simply presented the gold. He slid the crown piece of the thick leather over the horse's ears. He guided the heavy golden bit toward the velvet lips. Pegasus parted his teeth, accepting the cold, unyielding gold. The bit settled firmly against the bars of his mouth. The taming was complete. There was no violent struggle, no breaking of the spirit. It was a merging. The chaotic, airborne power of the winged steed was now irrevocably linked to the calculated, desperate, and focused will of the mortal rider. The instrument of Athena had bridged the gap. The young warrior gripped the thick leather reins. He placed his hand upon the incredibly broad, muscular shoulder of the horse, feeling the immense, latent power humming beneath the white coat. With a swift, practiced motion, he vaulted onto the animal's back, sitting just behind the junction, where the massive wings sprouted from the shoulders. He was no longer a man standing in the dirt. He was seated upon a throne of muscle and feather, holding the reins of the storm. He gently squeezed his knees against the horse's flanks. The response was immediate and terrifyingly powerful. Pegasus did not trot or gallop forward. He simply leaped upward, a massive, explosive contraction of his hindquarters, launching them vertically into the air. Simultaneously, the vast white wings snapped open. The first downward stroke of the feathers hit the air with the percussive force of a thunderclap. The downdraft flattened the oleander bushes and sent a spray of water erupting from the spring. The ground fell away with sickening, exhilarating speed. The heavy, oppressive weight of the earth vanished, replaced by the crushing, rushing pressure of the wind. They climbed higher and higher, breaking through the lower layers of the atmosphere, ascending into the cold, thin, pure air of the high ether. The young rider leaned forward, wrapping his fingers deeply into the thick white mane, his eyes watering from the intense, rushing wind. He looked down. The massive citadel of Corinth, the sprawling city, the two great seas, they were all reduced to small, insignificant patterns on the surface of the world. He felt a profound, euphoric sense of absolute liberation, the crushing weight of his exile, the dark stain of the blood guilt, the terrifying, suffocating anxiety of the death warrant. All of it felt distant, small, and irrelevant up here, in the blinding blue vault of the sky. He was untouchable. He was a predator of the clouds, moving with a speed and freedom that no mortal had ever experienced. He gently pulled the right rein, feeling the immediate, smooth response of the golden bit. Pegasus banked gracefully, the massive wings tilting, carving a wide, sweeping arc through the sky. The rider turned his face toward the east, toward the sea, toward the dark, jagged, smoking peaks waiting on the distant horizon. The tactical problem had been solved. He had removed the earth from the equation. He possessed the ultimate high ground. He possessed the speed, the maneuverability, and the untouchable altitude to engage the impossible monster on his own terms. The testing flight was over. The journey to the burning kingdom must begin. The young exile, riding upon the back of the immortal, sky-born steed, leveled his spear and pointed the horse toward the rising smoke of Lycia. The air grew colder as they climbed above the clouds, a silent, breathtaking approach toward a confrontation that would set the heavens on fire. The lion roared below. The goat breathed its flame. But now, a shadow was falling across the sun. The wings of retribution were approaching the ash-covered valleys. The ultimate duel between the nightmare of the earth and the miracle of the sky was about to commence. The ascent into the upper atmosphere offered a profound, chilling isolation from the heavy concerns of the earth. Riding upon the broad, muscular back of the immortal winged steed, the young warrior experienced a silence that mortal ears are rarely privileged to hear. The relentless, crashing noise of the ocean waves, the clamor of the crowded city streets, the groaning of the heavy wooden ships, all of these sounds fell away, swallowed by the vast, empty expanse of the lower air. Up here, in the thin, freezing domain of the clouds, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic beating of the massive white wings. Each downward stroke of the thick feathers pushed against the invisible currents of the sky, propelling them forward with a smooth, terrifying velocity that defied the heavy pull of the ground. The air at this altitude was sharp and pure, smelling faintly of ozone and cold moisture. The rider leaned low over the thick, snowy mane of the horse, his fingers intertwined with the coarse hair, his eyes narrowed against the biting, rushing wind. He could feel the immense, latent power radiating from the animal beneath him. The muscles of the horse's back contracted and released in a perfect, continuous rhythm, a living engine of divine engineering. The golden bit rested securely in the horse's mouth, a silent, heavy conductor of the rider's will, bridging the vast gap between the fragile human mind and the chaotic primordial energy of the sky-born beast. Far below, the geography of the ancient world scrolled past in slow, deliberate silence. The deep azure expanse of the Aegean Sea stretched out toward the horizon, its surface wrinkled with tiny, insignificant whitecaps. The rugged islands of the archipelago appeared as small, dark stones scattered across a vast blue floor. The rider guided the horse eastward, aiming toward the jagged, imposing coastline of the Anatolian peninsula. He was moving away from the safety of the known world, traveling deliberately toward the epicenter of a localized apocalypse. The transition from the pure, cold ether of the sky to the corrupted, suffocating atmosphere of the beast's domain was not sudden. It was a gradual, creeping pollution of the environment. Long before the jagged peaks of Mount Cragus became visible to the naked eye, the air began to change. The pristine, biting cold of the high altitude slowly gave way to a strange, oppressive warmth. The wind, previously a clean, rushing force, began to carry a faint, metallic taste, leaving a thin, bitter residue on the rider's lips. The smell of ozone was replaced by the unmistakable stench of burning pine resin, ancient stone, and heavy sulfur. The sky ahead lost its vibrant, blinding blue hue, taking on a sickly, yellowish-gray pallor. They were entering the perimeter of the nightmare. They were crossing the invisible boundary into the airspace claimed by the Chimera. Pegasus sensed the corruption immediately. The immortal horse tossed his beautiful, sculpted head, snorting violently to clear the stinging ash from his velvet nostrils. The rhythm of his wings faltered for a fraction of a second, a subtle hesitation born of deep, instinctual revulsion. The horse was a creature of the high, clean storm, an entity of pure, unblemished nature. The atmosphere they were entering was a violation, a toxic cloud of unnatural destruction bubbling up from the underworld. The rider gently tightened his grip on the thick leather reins, applying a steady, calming pressure to the golden bit, urging the immense creature forward, deeper into the gathering smog. As they flew closer to the Lycian coastline, the source of the corruption became undeniably clear. The entire mountain range of Cragus was obscured by a massive, continuously roiling plume of dark, greasy smoke. The smoke did not behave like the byproduct of a natural forest fire. It moved with a heavy, malevolent purpose, clinging to the deep ravines and smothering the jagged peaks. Beneath this thick, gray blanket, the earth itself seemed to be glowing. Deep, angry veins of dull red and blinding white heat pulsed through the shadows of the canyons, illuminating the dense smoke from within. The rider guided Pegasus into a wide, sweeping circle, maintaining a high altitude, remaining hidden within the upper layers of the thick ash cloud. He needed to observe. He needed to locate the epicenter of the devastation. He needed to find the impossible creature that was slowly erasing a kingdom from the face of the earth. The search required absolute patience. The smoke was a physical barrier, blinding the eyes and choking the lungs. The young warrior peered over the side of the horse's neck, his eyes watering profusely from the chemical sting of the sulphurous air. He tracked the patterns of the destruction below. He looked for the freshest burns, the areas where the smoke was thickest and the heat was most intense. He watched the ancient cedar forests flash vaporize into swirling columns of gray dust. And then, deep within a steep, rocky gorge, surrounded by the charred skeletal remains of massive trees, he saw the movement. From the extreme altitude of the clouds, the Chimera did not appear immediately monstrous. She looked like a small, chaotic spark of violently shifting colors moving slowly across the blackened earth. But as the rider urged Pegasus to descend slightly, dropping through a temporary break in the smoke, the true, horrifying scale of the beast snapped into focus. She was massive, a lumbering, heavy amalgamation of predatory muscle and divine fire. The golden pelt of the lion forefront was coated in thick layers of gray ash, the broad, heavy shoulders shifting with devastating power as she navigated the broken, rocky terrain. Trailing behind, the massive speckled coils of the serpent tail whipped back and forth, dragging across the stone, acting as a terrifying autonomous rearguard. but it was the center of the creature that drew the eye and paralyzed the mind. Rising from the spine, the heavy, coarse neck supported the head of the mountain goat. The goat's head was completely engulfed in a blinding, white-hot luminescence, a terrifying internal furnace that radiated outward, distorting the air around the monster in a shimmering, violent heat haze. The young warrior pulled back on the reins, halting their descent. He sat suspended in the sky, observing the behavior of the beast. He realized immediately the profound, lethal complication of his chosen battleground. He had assumed that possessing the high ground would grant him absolute impunity. He had planned to simply dive upon the monster, driving his heavy, bronze-tipped spear through the spine, ending the terror with a single, devastating application of gravity and sharp metal. He had fundamentally misunderstood the physics of the fire. The Chimera was not a static target. She was a living, breathing volcano. The constant, roaring torrent of flame erupting from the goat's mouth created massive, violent columns of superheated air. These thermals shot upward with the force of a physical blow. If he attempted a direct, vertical dive, the intense updraft would catch the massive, broad wings of Pegasus, throwing the horse wildly off course, tumbling them out of the sky like dry leaves caught in a hurricane. Furthermore, the ambient temperature surrounding the beast was lethal. The air was a searing, oxygen-starved vacuum. If they flew too close, the intense heat would instantly scorch the pure white feathers of the horse's wings, crippling his ability to fly. The rider's own bronze armor, designed to deflect the blows of mortal weapons, would quickly absorb the radiant heat, turning into a glowing, suffocating cage that would burn his flesh to the bone. And the spear itself, the primary weapon of the ancient warrior, was utterly useless. The long, balanced shaft was carved from seasoned ash wood. If he thrust the weapon toward the blazing goat's head, the wood would spontaneously combust long before the bronze tip ever made contact with the creature's coarse hair. He would be left holding a handful of useless, crumbling charcoal, entirely disarmed while suspended above an open furnace. The beast possessed a perfect, impenetrable defense. Her very nature, the constant, suffocating emission of divine fire, created an absolute barrier that no conventional weapon and no conventional tactic could breach. Down in the gorge, the Chimera suddenly stopped moving. The heavy, disjointed body froze. The massive, golden head of the lion tilted upward, the dark, blood-matted mane bristling with sudden, violent static. The unblinking, lidless eyes of the serpent tail swiveled skyward, tracking the invisible currents of the air. The creature possessed senses that extended far beyond the visual spectrum. She felt the subtle displacement of the air pressure caused by the hovering horse. She felt the shadow passing over the smoke. The monster realized she was being hunted. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The lion unleashed a deafening, guttural roar, a sound of pure, ancient fury that vibrated up through the thick column of smoke, rattling the bronze greaves against the rider's shins. The serpent hissed, a high, piercing note that promised venom and death. But the goat head reacted with lethal physical force. The thick, muscular neck twisted, aiming the dark, swept-back horns directly toward the sky. The rectangular, dead yellow eyes locked onto the general location of the horse hidden within the clouds. The jaw unhinged. A massive, roaring pillar of solid, white-hot flame erupted upward. The fire did not dissipate quickly. It climbed the sky with terrifying speed, a concentrated beam of total annihilation burning through the gray smoke. The intense heat hit the underbelly of Pegasus, causing the immortal horse to scream, a high, unnatural sound of distress. The horse kicked out with his heavy hooves, scrambling frantically against the thin air, fighting the violent, chaotic turbulence created by the rising thermal. The rider hauled desperately on the golden bit, pulling the horse into a sharp, banking turn, diving away from the rising column of fire. They barely escaped the outer edge of the flame. The radiant heat seared the rider's exposed arms, leaving the skin tight, red, and screaming with pain. The ends of the horse's long white tail feathers were singed brown, filling the air with the sharp, unpleasant smell of burnt hair. The young warrior guided the horse to a safe, extreme altitude, putting miles of cold air between himself and the burning gorge. His heart hammered against his ribs. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He patted the sweating, trembling neck of the winged steed, whispering low, calming words to soothe the panicked animal. He had survived the first encounter, but the reality of the situation was grim. He was facing an entity that weaponized the very atmosphere. He could not pierce her armor, because her armor was a wall of inextinguishable heat. He could not get close, because the air itself would melt his flesh and burn his steed. He needed a profound change in strategy. He needed a weapon that ignored the rules of conventional warfare. He needed to turn the beast's ultimate strength, the roaring, subterranean fire, into the instrument of her own agonizing destruction. The ancient mythological records, specifically the meticulous compilations of Apollodorus, reveal the cold, terrifying genius of the solution. The young warrior, resting upon a distant, barren peak far above the smoke, dismounted from the winged horse. He opened the small leather satchel tied securely to his heavy bronze belt. He did not pull out a magical talisman. He did not retrieve a divine arrow or a net woven by the gods. He pulled out a solid, unshaped lump of lead. Lead is a heavy, dull, deeply unglamorous metal. It possesses no sharp edge. It cannot be honed into a lethal point. In the age of bronze and iron, it was an industrial material, used for weights, for sealing the hulls of ships, and for lining the pipes of ancient cisterns. It is dense, malleable, and incredibly heavy. But lead possesses one crucial, defining physical property. It has an exceptionally low melting point. The warrior sat upon the cold stone of the mountain peak, the heavy gray metal resting in the palm of his hand. He looked at his long ash-wood spear. The bronze tip was sharp, polished, and deadly to a mortal man, but completely useless against the inferno. With slow, deliberate movements, he began to prepare the weapon. He placed the heavy lump of lead against the sharp bronze point of the spear. Using a heavy, rounded stone gathered from the mountaintop, he began to carefully, forcefully hammer the malleable metal. He pounded the dull gray substance until it flattened and wrapped securely around the lethal bronze tip, creating a heavy, blunt, asymmetrical bulb at the end of the long wooden shaft. He bound the lead securely to the wood using thick, wet leather thongs, ensuring that the heavy mass would not shift or fall during a high-speed maneuver. He tested the balance of the spear. The weapon was now incredibly front-heavy, awkward, and entirely useless for a throwing attack or a conventional thrust. It was no longer an instrument designed to pierce flesh. It was an instrument designed to deliver a payload. The logic of the plan was cold, precise, and required a level of suicidal bravery that defied human comprehension. He could not fight the fire from the outside. He had to extinguish the furnace from within. He intended to drive the heavy block of lead directly into the open, roaring maw of the goat. He understood the physics of the impending collision. The wooden shaft of the spear would burn away instantly. The bronze tip might eventually melt, but the lead would liquefy immediately upon entering the blinding, white-hot heat of the creature's throat. The heavy, boiling, molten metal would pour down the creature's gullet, flooding the windpipe, searing the internal organs, and physically blocking the airway. The beast would choke on her own inescapable heat, suffocating beneath a heavy, hardening seal of dull gray metal. It was a brilliant, flawless strategy, but the execution required a degree of precision and timing that bordered on the impossible. He must dive directly through the rising thermal of the fire. He must maintain perfect, unwavering control of the winged horse, while the ambient temperature climbed to lethal levels. He must look directly into the blinding light of the goat's throat, completely exposed to the physical trauma of the roaring sound and the suffocating lack of oxygen. And he must deliver the heavy, awkward spear with absolute pinpoint accuracy in the fraction of a second before the heat incinerated them both. There was no margin for error. A slight miscalculation in the angle of the dive, a momentary hesitation from the horse, a slight flinch from the intense heat. Any of these minor failures would result in their immediate, horrific incineration. The warrior stood up. He checked the leather bindings of his armor, ensuring everything was tight and secure. He checked the thick, golden buckles of the bridle. He ran his hand down the smooth wooden shaft of the prepared spear, feeling the heavy, blunt weight of the lead block at the tip. He walked to the edge of the mountain peak. Below him, the vast, undulating ocean of gray smoke stretched out toward the horizon, concealing the valleys of Lycia in a suffocating shroud. He could see the faint, pulsing glow of the fire moving slowly through the deep ravines. He mounted the immortal horse. He settled his weight perfectly into the center of the broad back. He wrapped the thick leather reins securely around his left hand, gripping the heavy, modified spear tightly in his right. He closed his eyes, taking one final, deep breath of the cold, clean mountain air. He locked the image of the open, roaring goat's mouth in his mind. He banished the fear. He banished the instinct for self-preservation. He reduced his entire existence to the single, cold mathematical equation of velocity, trajectory, and molten metal. He squeezed his knees against the white flanks. Pegasus leaped from the peak. The massive wings snapped open, catching the cold wind, propelling them outward over the massive expanse of the smoke cloud. They climbed high, seeking the absolute apex of their trajectory, aligning themselves directly over the glowing, moving ember hidden in the gorge below. The rider found the position. He was directly above the beast. He leaned far forward, pressing his chest completely flat against the horse's neck. He pulled the golden bit sharply, tucking the horse's head down. "Now," he whispered into the roaring wind. Pegasus understood the command. The immortal horse pulled his massive white wings tightly against his body, folding the feathers flat, completely eliminating his aerodynamic lift. They dropped. The descent was not a flight. It was a terrifying, vertical freefall. The acceleration was instantaneous and crushing. The wind transformed from a rushing sound into a deafening, physical scream, tearing at the rider's hair, threatening to rip the heavy bronze shield from his arm. The world blurred into a rushing tunnel of gray smoke and rapidly approaching stone. They plunged directly into the thick, sulphurous cloud. The light of the sun vanished, replaced by the chaotic, swirling darkness of the ash. The air temperature spiked violently. The cold of the high altitude was instantly erased, replaced by a heavy, suffocating heat that immediately drew the moisture from the rider's eyes and the sweat from his pores. Down in the gorge, the Chimera sensed the rapidly approaching mass. The creature stopped. The heavy, disjointed body braced itself against the rocky floor. The golden head of the lion roared, the jaws snapping at the falling ash. The serpent tail coiled tightly, ready to strike blindly at whatever emerged from the smoke above. The goat head tilted upward, the dark, swept-back horns leveled. The rectangular, yellow eyes locked onto the falling shadow. The jaws unhinged, revealing the blinding, white-hot furnace of the throat. The beast inhaled, drawing the ambient oxygen into its lungs, preparing to unleash a massive, concentrated pillar of divine fire to incinerate the falling threat. The timing was terrifyingly perfect. The rider and the horse broke through the bottom layer of the smoke cloud, emerging into the hellish, glowing twilight of the burning gorge. The beast was directly below them, growing larger with horrifying speed. The heat radiating from the open goat's mouth was a physical wall. The rider felt the exposed skin of his face instantly blister. The coarse, white hair of the horse's mane began to curl and singe. The air was completely devoid of oxygen, replaced entirely by the toxic, superheated exhaust of the impending eruption. The rider did not flinch. He did not close his eyes against the blinding light. He drove his knees hard into the horse's flanks, maintaining the absolute vertical trajectory. He brought his right arm back, gripping the heavy, awkward spear with every ounce of his mortal strength. The goat unleashed the fire. The roar of the eruption was deafening, a concussive blast of sound that threatened to shatter the eardrums. The solid pillar of white-hot flame rushed upward, a torrent of absolute destruction aimed directly at the falling horse. In the fraction of a second, before the fire enveloped them, the rider struck. He did not throw the weapon. He used the immense, accumulated momentum of the vertical freefall to drive the spear downward. He thrust the heavy, lead-wrapped tip directly into the center of the rising flame, aiming for the glowing, open throat of the goat. The physical impact was jarring. The heavy block of lead smashed into the soft, glowing tissue of the beast's inner mouth, sliding deep into the searing, superheated channel of the throat. The rider immediately hauled violently on the golden bit. Pegasus snapped his massive wings open, catching the dense, heated air of the gorge. The sudden deceleration was agonizing, compressing the rider's spine, forcing the breath from his lungs. The horse banked sharply, fighting the massive updraft of the fire, pulling out of the dive mere feet above the snapping jaws of the lion and the striking fangs of the serpent. They tore away from the beast, climbing desperately back toward the safety of the upper smoke, leaving the spear embedded deeply in the creature's maw. The long ashwood shaft of the spear vaporized instantly, reduced to a cloud of fine, black ash the moment it touched the divine flame. The bronze tip, hidden beneath the heavy metal, began to glow a dull, angry red. But the lead performed exactly as the cold logic of the plan dictated. The heavy, dull gray block of metal, thrust directly into the epicenter of the divine furnace, absorbed the unimaginable heat. The melting point was breached in a matter of milliseconds. The solid block collapsed, transforming instantly into a heavy, boiling, viscous liquid. The horrific mechanics of the beast's own anatomy sealed its doom. As the goat attempted to inhale, drawing breath to sustain the roaring pillar of flame, it drew the molten liquid deeper into its own respiratory system. The heavy, boiling lead poured down the windpipe, a creeping, searing tide of liquid metal. It flooded the bronchial tubes, filling the massive lungs that fueled the fire. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The pillar of flame erupting from the goat's mouth sputtered, choked, and abruptly died, replaced by a thick, wet, hissing cloud of black smoke and boiling steam. The blinding, white-hot luminescence of the throat flickered and rapidly dimmed. The Chimera realized she was dying from the inside out. The agony of the melting metal, searing the internal organs, destroying the soft tissue, and blocking the airway caused the beast to completely lose its terrifying, disjointed coordination. The monster descended into a chaotic, blind frenzy of unimaginable pain. The heavy, lion forefront clawed frantically at the rocky ground, tearing massive, smoking boulders from the earth, trying to outrun the searing agony burning within its chest. The golden eyes widened in pure, primal terror. The massive jaws snapped wildly at the empty air, the guttural roars transforming into desperate, wet, choking sounds as the liquid metal filled the throat. The serpent tail, entirely disconnected from the source of the pain, lashed out with blind, indiscriminate fury. The thick, muscular coils whipped against the charred trunks of the dead cedar trees, shattering the wood with the sound of cannon fire. The venomous fangs bit deeply into the stone floor of the gorge, snapping the long teeth against the granite, injecting useless, toxic venom into the dead earth. The beast thrashed, a massive, uncoordinated mass of dying muscle and suffocating heat. She rolled violently against the steep walls of the ravine, causing massive landslides of loose scree and blackened soil to rain down upon her. The heavy, dragging weight of her body crushed the remaining, smoldering vegetation, leaving deep, erratic trenches in the baked mud. The internal furnace, choked by the heavy, cooling seal of the lead, began to rapidly consume the available oxygen within the creature's own body. The fire, unable to vent outward, turned inward, scorching the veins and boiling the blood. The death throes lasted for an agonizing, terrifying span of time. The sheer, primordial vitality of the creature, the dark genetics inherited from Typhon and Echidna, fought desperately against the inevitable, cold reality of suffocation. But the lead was cooling. The heavy metal was hardening within the ruined lungs, forming a solid, immovable cast of dull gray death, sealing the airway completely. The chaotic, frantic movements of the beast began to slow. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the lion's paws striking the stone grew weaker, the pauses between the impacts lengthening. The violent thrashing of the serpent tail subsided into slow, erratic twitches. The goat head, the source of the devastating terror, hung limply from the thick, coarse neck. The dark, swept-back horns scraped weakly against the stone. The rectangular, dead yellow eyes stared blankly into the swirling smoke, the cold, alien detachment finally replaced by the absolute stillness of death. With one final, heavy, shuddering exhalation, a long, wet sound that carried the last of the sulphurous smoke from her ruined lungs, the massive, disjointed body collapsed completely onto the scorched earth. The heavy muscles relaxed. The tension drained from the massive paws. The Chimera lay dead upon the floor of the ruined gorge. High above, resting safely within the upper layers of the thinning smoke, the young rider sat upon the back of the immortal winged horse. He stared down at the dark, motionless shape, resting among the shattered rocks. His arms ached, his skin burned, and his breath came in slow, ragged gasps. He had done the impossible. He had used the heavy, dull weight of human industry to choke the unquenchable, divine fire of the underworld. He had silenced the roar of the lion, blinded the strike of the serpent, and extinguished the flame of the goat. The sky above Lycia was quiet. The thick, rolling clouds of smoke, no longer fueled by the constant, roaring heat of the beast, began to slowly dissipate, tearing apart in the cool, high-altitude winds. The sun, previously a sickly, blood-red disk, began to shine brightly through the clearing haze, casting a clean, golden light over the ruined, silent valleys. The beast was dead, but the story of the exiled rider and the skyborne steed was not yet finished. The victory was absolute, but in the complex, treacherous cosmology of the ancient Greeks, human triumph often breeds a dangerous, intoxicating pride. The heavy burden of the blood guilt had been lifted. The impossible task had been completed. But the true test of a mortal's character lies not in how he handles defeat, but in how he manages absolute, soaring victory. The flight must continue. The descent back to the earth, and the tragic consequences of flying too close to the immortal sun await in the final act of our saga. Close your eyes. Listen to the steady, rhythmic beating of the massive white wings against the clean, cold air. The fire is gone. The darkness is clearing. Let the silence of the high ether wash over you, cooling the burns and soothing the tired mind. The long journey is nearing its end. The heavy, stifling curtain of gray smoke began to tear apart, shredded by the clean, high-altitude winds sweeping in from the vast expanse of the Mediterranean Sea. As the young rider guided the immortal winged horse down from the freezing ether, the landscape of Lycia revealed itself in the harsh, uncompromising light of the late afternoon sun. It was a kingdom of scars. The deep ravines were choked with black ash. The ancient cedar forests were reduced to fields of splintered charcoal bones, and the once fertile valleys lay barren and baked. Yet, the air was changing. The oppressive, localized heat that had radiated from the slopes of Mount Cragus was dissipating, replaced by the natural cooling breeze of the approaching evening. The suffocating smell of burning sulfur was slowly giving way to the sharp, clean scent of the salty ocean spray. The beast was dead. The impossible equation had been solved. The descent toward the fortified palace of King Iobates was a slow, majestic glide. The massive white wings of Pegasus caught the golden light of the setting sun, turning the immortal steed into a brilliant, glowing beacon descending from the heavens. The citizens of Lycia, who had lived in a state of perpetual cowering terror for months, emerged cautiously from their fortified stone dwellings and hidden sea caves. They shielded their eyes, looking upward, their minds struggling to comprehend the sight. The dark, omnipresent plume of smoke that had dominated their northern horizon was gone, and in its place rode a single golden-armored figure upon a creature of absolute myth. The heavy wooden gates of the palace courtyard were thrown wide open. The young warrior brought the winged horse to a gentle, precise landing upon the polished marble flagstones. The heavy hooves struck the stone with a resonant, ringing clarity that echoed through the silent, awestruck colonnades. He dismounted, his legs trembling slightly from the immense physical and psychological strain of the airborne duel. His bronze armor was scorched and warped. His face was blackened with soot, and his exposed skin was violently blistered by the radiant heat of the divine fire. But his eyes were clear, burning with the quiet, undeniable authority of a man who had looked into the open throat of annihilation and emerged victorious. King Iobates stood on the high steps of the palace entrance, surrounded by his elite, trembling guard. The king's face was a mask of profound, terrified disbelief. The trap had failed. The absolute, unkillable nightmare of the earth had been bested by a mortal youth carrying a sealed wooden tablet. Iobates looked at the exhausted, soot-stained warrior, and he looked at the magnificent, terrifyingly powerful winged horse standing quietly beside him. The king realized that the balance of power in his kingdom had shifted instantly and irrevocably. The young exile was no longer just a messenger or a convenient sacrifice. He was a conqueror of the impossible. But the fatal, unbroken command from King Proetus of Argos still burned in the mind of the Lycian monarch. The young man must die. If the fire of the Chimera could not consume him, then the brutal, grinding attrition of human warfare must do the job. With a voice that struggled to maintain its regal composure, Iobates welcomed the hero back, masking his deep, calculating dread behind a facade of royal gratitude. He did not ask for proof of the beast's demise. The clear, smoke-free sky was evidence enough. Instead, he immediately set the wheels of his secondary, desperate plan into motion. He praised the young rider, pouring sweet, dark wine into golden cups, wrapping the warrior in fine, clean linens, and tending to his burns with soothing herbal salves. And then, with the treacherous smoothness of a seasoned politician, he presented the next insurmountable challenge. He spoke of the Solymi, a fierce, deeply hostile tribe of mountain warriors who dwelled on the high, craggy borders of Lycia. He described them as a plague upon the land, a relentless, bloodthirsty force that constantly raided the outer settlements, slaughtering the livestock and carrying off the women and children. "You have saved us from the terror of the beast, hero," the king proclaimed, his voice echoing in the great hall. "But my kingdom is still bleeding. The Solymi are a thorn in the side of Lycia, a threat that my own exhausted armies cannot repel. If you are truly the chosen champion of the gods, ride out once more. Subdue the fierce Solymi and secure the borders of this grateful land." The young warrior, his mind still vibrating with the adrenaline of his previous victory, accepted the task without hesitation. He did not recognize the political maneuvering. He only saw an opportunity to further solidify his honor and prove his worth. He mounted the sky-born steed once more, leaving the comforts of the palace behind. But the war against the Solymi was not a conventional, grinding infantry campaign of bronze against bronze. The rider possessed the ultimate, unassailable tactical advantage. He did not march his forces up the steep, treacherous mountain passes where they could be ambushed by the fierce tribesmen. He took to the sky. He flew Pegasus high above the rocky redoubts of the enemy. The Solymi warriors, renowned for their unmatched ferocity and skill with the short bow, were reduced to terrified, helpless targets. The rider gathered heavy, jagged boulders from the high, desolate peaks and dropped them with devastating, pinpoint accuracy upon the enemy camps below. The Solymi fired their arrows upward, but the shafts lost their momentum long before they reached the soaring, white-winged horse, falling harmlessly back to the earth. The tribe was broken, scattered, and utterly defeated from the air, crushed by a localized man-made meteor shower. When the warrior returned, victorious and unscathed, Iobates felt a cold, tightening grip of absolute panic. The king's desperation escalated. He immediately sent the hero out again, this time to face an enemy even more legendary and terrifying than the Solymi. He sent him against the Amazons, the mythical, fearsome tribe of warrior women who fought with unmatched brutality and rode into battle with the speed of a storm. Again, the young rider ascended into the clouds. Again, the absolute superiority of the aerial assault rendered the formidable earth-bound tactics of the enemy completely obsolete. The Amazons, masters of the cavalry charge and the sweeping flank maneuver, could not charge the sky. The warrior rained heavy, bronze-tipped spears down upon their formations, breaking their lines and scattering their fierce, disciplined ranks into the dust. He returned to the Lycian palace, his legend growing, his invincibility seemingly confirmed by the very heavens. Iobates, pushed to the absolute breaking point of his regal authority, abandoned the guise of the noble quest. In a final, desperate, and deeply dishonorable act, he gathered the absolute best, the bravest, and the most lethal warriors of his own Lycian guard. He positioned them in a narrow, inescapable ambush along the primary road leading back to the palace, instructing them to slaughter the returning hero without warning or mercy. The young rider, returning from his victory over the Amazons, sensed the trap. But he did not take to the sky to avoid the confrontation. The accumulation of his victories, the constant, unbroken string of impossible triumphs, had begun to alter his mind. He dismounted Pegasus. He drew his heavy bronze sword, raising his shield of layered oxhide, and walked deliberately into the narrow pass. The slaughter was absolute. The ancient texts are brief but unequivocal. The hero struck down every single one of the elite Lycian ambushers. He left the narrow pass choked with the bodies of the bravest men in the kingdom, their bronze armor shattered, their blood soaking into the dry dust of the road. When Bellerophon walked through the gates of the palace for the final time, his sword dripping with Lycian blood, King Iobates finally broke. The monarch realized the profound, terrifying truth that the gods themselves were actively protecting this young exile. To continue plotting against him was to invite the direct, annihilating wrath of Olympus down upon his own head. Iobates surrendered completely. He brought forth the sealed, fatal tablet he had received from Argos, revealing the treacherous, deadly lie that had initiated the entire ordeal. He showed the young warrior the baneful signs, confessing the plot. To make amends, to bind this unstoppable force of nature to his own failing bloodline, the king offered the ultimate prize. He gave Bellerophon the hand of his own daughter in marriage, and he ceded half of all the royal honors and fertile lands of the Lycian kingdom to the young hero. The exile was over. The accused murderer, the wandering outcast, had become the wealthiest, most powerful, and most universally feared man in the known world. He had a royal bride, vast estates of olive groves and vineyards, and the unquestioned adoration of the people he had saved. He had achieved the absolute pinnacle of mortal success. And this is exactly where the deepest, most insidious poison of the ancient world takes root. The Greeks understood a psychological progression that is as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. It begins with immense, unprecedented success. This success breeds a feeling of profound, untouchable satiety, a sense that the individual has transcended the normal boundaries of human limitation. This feeling swells, warping the mind, slowly transforming into an arrogant, blinding hubris. The mortal forgets his fragility. He forgets that he is made of earth and water, destined for the grave. He begins to look upward, not with reverence, but with a cold, calculating sense of equality. Bellerophon sat in his opulent, marble-floored palace, surrounded by unimaginable wealth and power. He looked out over the lands he had conquered and the people he ruled, but his eyes inevitably drifted away from the earth. He looked toward the sky. He possessed the immortal winged horse. He possessed the golden bridle, forged by the goddess of wisdom. He had slain the monster of the underworld, defeated the fiercest tribes, and broken the will of kings. He began to whisper a dark, seductive thought in the quiet, echoing chambers of his own mind. Why should a man who commands the sky, a man who has accomplished deeds rivaling the legends of the divine, remain bound to the mortal earth? Why should he grow old, his muscles weakening, his eyesight fading, waiting for the dark, cold embrace of the underworld? The hubris bloomed into a fatal, catastrophic decision. He decided he would not die. He decided he would ride the sky-born steed to the very summit of creation. He would ascend the steep, cloud-shrouded slopes of Mount Olympus, breach the golden gates of the gods, and take his rightful seat among the immortal council of Zeus. He believed his deeds had earned him a place at the high table, where they drank sweet nectar and ate ambrosia, free from the ravages of time and the heavy, grinding sorrow of the human condition. He walked out to the secluded courtyard where Pegasus was kept. The immortal horse grazed quietly, his massive white wings folded neatly against his sides. The young king, blinded by his own towering arrogance, approached the beast. He did not offer a sacrifice. He did not utter a prayer of supplication to the gods who had granted him the golden bridle. He simply slipped the heavy, divine metal between the horse's teeth, swung himself onto the broad, powerful back, and commanded the creature to fly. They launched into the air, the powerful downdraft flattening the grass of the courtyard. They climbed higher and faster than ever before. Bellerophon urged the horse upward, past the lower, fluffy layers of the cumulus clouds, past the thin, freezing wisps of the cirrus, driving the immortal steed directly toward the blinding, unapproachable zenith of the sky. The air grew impossibly thin and freezing cold, but the rider felt no discomfort. He was consumed by a burning, manic euphoria. He looked down, watching the entire world shrink into a meaningless, indistinct blur of blue and green. He was leaving the realm of death behind. He was ascending to his destiny. High above, seated upon his golden throne at the apex of the cosmos, Zeus, the gatherer of the clouds, observed the approaching speck. The king of the gods saw the magnificent white horse, his own personal thunder-bearer, being driven upward by the heavy, arrogant will of a mortal man. Zeus did not fly into a raging fury. He did not stand up and hurl a jagged, white-hot thunderbolt to blast the rider into ash. A thunderbolt is a weapon of respect, a tool used to combat titans, massive monsters, and threats of cosmic proportions. To use the lightning against a foolish, arrogant human would be an elevation of the man's status. It would validate his hubris. The punishment of Zeus was infinitely more subtle, deeply ironic, and profoundly humiliating. The ruler of the sky reached out and summoned a creature of absolute insignificant triviality. He summoned a single, biting insect, a gadfly. The god sent this tiny, buzzing speck of biological annoyance hurtling downward through the ether, directing it with divine, unerring precision toward the ascending winged horse. The gadfly bypassed the rider entirely. It bypassed the heavy golden bridle. It landed precisely upon the sensitive, unprotected skin just beneath the base of the immortal horse's tail, and it bit deeply. The reaction of the divine steed was instantaneous, violent, and completely uncontrollable. Pegasus, a creature of the high storm, unaccustomed to the sharp, stinging pain of earthly parasites, let out a piercing, high-pitched scream of distress. The horse violently threw his head down, arching his massive back in a sudden, explosive buck that completely shattered his smooth, ascending trajectory. The massive white wings flared wildly, catching the thin air at a chaotic, unstable angle. The young king, his mind entirely focused on the golden gates of Olympus, was caught completely off guard. He had expected the smooth, powerful ascent to continue indefinitely. He had not braced for the sudden, violent contortion of the animal beneath him. His grip on the thick, white mane slipped. The heavy leather reins, connected to the golden bridle of Athena, tore violently from his hands, burning the skin of his palms as they whipped away. Bellerophon lost his seat. He was thrown forward, tumbling over the horse's massive, shifting shoulders. For one terrifying frozen second, he hung suspended in the freezing, thin air of the upper atmosphere. He looked into the wild, dark eyes of the immortal horse as Pegasus righted himself, shaking off the sting of the insect, completely unburdened by the weight of the arrogant mortal. Then, the relentless, cold, unforgiving mathematics of gravity reasserted their absolute dominion. The fall began. It was not a quick, merciful plunge. It was a long, agonizing, horrifying descent through the endless miles of the open sky. The wind, which had been his ally, his tool of conquest, transformed into a deafening, roaring beast tearing at his clothing and his flesh. The air pressure built rapidly, crushing his chest, forcing the breath from his lungs in a continuous, silent scream. He tumbled uncontrollably, seeing the blue sky and the distant, rapidly approaching earth spinning in a chaotic, nauseating blur. He had believed himself a god, untouchable and supreme. In the span of a single heartbeat, caused by the bite of a tiny fly, he was reduced to a fragile, heavy sack of blood and brittle bone, plummeting helplessly back to the dirt from which he was made. The impact was catastrophic. He did not land in the soft, welcoming waters of the sea, nor did he strike the unforgiving stone of a mountain peak. The ancient poets tell us that he crashed into a desolate, thorny wasteland in the southern reaches of the Anatolian peninsula. The sheer force of the impact shattered his legs, driving the broken bones through the skin. The violent, concussive shockwave of hitting the ground detached his retinas and irreparably damaged his optic nerves, plunging him instantly and permanently into absolute darkness. He did not die. The gods, in their infinite, terrifying cruelty, denied him the clean release of death. He survived the fall, but he was utterly, fundamentally broken. He was a blind, crippled, agonizingly pain-racked shell of a human being. The magnificent beauty that had cursed him in the halls of Argos was gone, replaced by the twisted, scarred visage of a man who had been chewed up and spat out by the very sky. The region where he fell became known as the Ilian Plain, the Plain of Wandering. For the remainder of his long, miserable life, Bellerophon crawled and limped through the dry, thorny scrub brush of this desolate wasteland. He was completely alone. He was shunned by the immortal gods, who viewed his hubris with cold disgust. He avoided the paths of mortal men, deeply ashamed of his ruined state, unable to bear the pity or the mockery of those who had once worshipped him as a hero. He wandered in absolute suffocating darkness, leaning on a rough wooden staff, dragging his shattered legs through the dust. He survived on whatever bitter roots and stagnant water he could find by touch. The ancient texts describe his final days with a haunting, melancholic phrase. He wandered the plain, consuming his own soul. He was left with nothing but the endless, agonizing memories of the high, cold wind, the smooth, powerful beat of the white wings, and the blinding, terrifying moment when he realized he was falling. He was a man who had touched the edge of divinity, only to be smashed back into the deepest, darkest trenches of mortal suffering. High above, Pegasus returned to the golden halls of Olympus, assuming his rightful place as the bearer of the thunderbolt, entirely unconcerned with the fate of the broken man wandering in the dust below. The saga of the exiled rider ends in silence and shadow. But the legacy of the beast he slew, the nightmare that initiated this entire chain of heroic triumph and catastrophic ruin, refuses to be extinguished. We must travel back, away from the dry, dusty winds of the Ilian Plain, and return to the rugged, pine-scented mountains of Lycia. We must return to the steep, rocky slopes of Mount Cragus, to the place where the impossible monster took her final, suffocating breath. The physical body of the Chimera, the heavy lion, the venomous serpent, the coarse goat, rotted away millennia ago. The bones turned to dust, mixing with the dark soil and the gray ash, eventually nourishing the new growth of cedar and wild olive trees that reclaimed the devastated valleys. The physical threat was entirely erased by the heavy, melting block of lead. But the ancient Greeks understood that a force of pure, primordial chaos, a direct descendant of the subterranean storm and the immortal serpent, cannot simply be wiped from the face of the earth without leaving a profound, permanent scar. The essence of the creature, the dread might of the blazing fire inherited from the deepest, darkest pits of Tartarus, survived the death of the flesh. The fire sank deep into the bedrock. It retreated into the labyrinthine network of limestone caves and porous rock beneath the mountain, seeking refuge in the dark, lightless depths of the earth. And there, it found a new, eternal source of fuel. Today, if you walk up the quiet, shadowed path near the ruins of the ancient city of Olympos, you will hear a faint, rhythmic sound. It is a soft, hissing whisper, like the sound of wind escaping through a narrow crack in a heavy door. As you step out of the dense pine forest and onto the barren, rocky clearing of Yanartaş, you will see the physical manifestation of the myth. Dozens of small, bright fires dance and flicker across the surface of the pale gray stone. They emerge directly from the solid rock, fueled by ancient, deep-seated vents of methane gas. They burn continuously, ignoring the dampness of the winter rain and the heavy, humid heat of the summer sun. They cast erratic, dancing shadows against the surrounding trees, filling the air with the sharp, unmistakable scent of ancient, roasting earth. To stand among these eternal flames in the quiet depth of the night is to stand in the presence of a ghost. The heat radiating from the rocks is not the gentle warmth of a campfire. It is a harsh, biting heat, a localized, concentrated energy that feels profoundly out of place in the quiet, sleeping forest. The locals know the scientific explanation. They know about the geological pressures and the combustible gases. But the human mind, listening to the soft, rhythmic hiss of the escaping gas, inevitably drifts back to the ancient poetry. The mind pictures the heavy, coarse neck of the goat, trapped forever beneath the weight of the mountain, still trying to breathe its divine, unquenchable fire into the world above. The Chimera is dead, but she is not silent. She continues to breathe. She continues to burn. The fires of Yanartaş are a permanent geological monument to the terrifying chaotic forces that lurk just beneath the thin, fragile surface of our ordered world. They are a reminder of a time when monsters walked the earth, when the air smelled of sulfur and ash, and when heroes rode the storm clouds to fight the living furnaces of the underworld. The myth has seeped into the stone. The legend has become geography. And as long as the earth continues to vent its deep, hidden gases, as long as the flames continue to dance upon the rocky slopes of Lycia, the terrifying, magnificent legacy of the Chimera will endure. The long journey is over. The smoke has cleared. The wings have faded into the high blue distance. Take a deep, slow breath. Let the tension flow out of your muscles, sinking down into the solid, safe earth beneath you. Allow the cool, quiet darkness of the present moment to wash away the heat of the ancient fires and the sharp, rushing winds of the high sky. The monsters are gone. The heroes are resting in the dust. If you found comfort in the shadows of this ancient saga, if the slow, deep rhythms of the myth provided a sanctuary from the noise of the waking world, please leave a gentle like on this video and softly subscribe to Hearths of Myths. There are countless more fires burning in the dark, countless more legends waiting to be unraveled in the quiet hours of the night. May your sleep be deep, untroubled by the roaring of the lion or the hissing of the serpent. May your dreams be grounded, safe from the dangerous, intoxicating heights of the high ether. Rest now, and let the embers of the story slowly, quietly fade to black. Sleep well.